All right, well, it hasn't been too long since I've been up here. So as I said in our agenda, today we're going to start with a little bit of a broad view of climate regulation, international organizations that you should be aware of or potentially can learn from because of the resources that they put out. All of these are potential ways to both, as I said, understand what may be coming within the market here within Mexico, but also for you to gain a little bit more knowledge of what the different ways that that climate may be a regulatory and disclosure related issue, as well as a traditional risk issue. So with that in mind, we'll begin with some of the basic building blocks around the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, popularly called the TCFD. Then we'll talk about some of the other relevant developments that exist within the climate space. And so the first thing that I would say is the TCFD was created with this, this idea in mind. As you can see, former governor of the Bank of England, head of the Financial Stability Board, head of now the Glasgow Financial Alliances for Net Zero, Mark Carney, made this point that fundamentally climate change affects all sectors, and companies that adapt to that are going to be successful in supporting and bringing about the opportunities of the new economy. Companies that are unprepared for climate risks, companies that are unprepared for the transition are going to see not only their successes diminish, but also see the market rapidly close and policies also move against them. And so the big issue here that was created was that when the TCFD was first developed, initially 2015 was when the TCFD was launched, and 2017 when its first recommendations came out. The idea really was to say, we don't have the information that we need about climate risk. We know that climate is becoming a bigger issue. In 2015, the Paris Agreement was signed. Climate had already been taking a toll around the world in terms of worsening physical effects. You heard a number of those things yesterday from myself and from Francisco. And one of the things that was recognized is in an already 1 degree warmer world, a world where we're rapidly seeing not only climate impacts, but also the shifts and transitions going on. In each of these, one of the big things that we really began to recognize was that organizations, financial actors, investors, and others across the economy didn't have the information to make good decisions on climate change because that information wasn't available. So some of the examples of that information are, well, how exposed is a company's assets to climate change? Do you know where those assets are located? How are those assets going to be affected, say, by sea level rise, by stronger storms? Similarly, another area that we didn't necessarily know as much about is the transition. As legislation, as policies are heating up in different countries, what are the negative impacts that that might have? Say you're a coal producer in a state within the rural United States. How is that company going to be affected? People didn't know these things, and as a result, without that information, there was more of a guesswork going on and a potential that by mispricing this risk, we would continue doing things like continue funding fossil fuels that were going to be negatively impactful. Similarly, we were going to continue putting money into investments that were likely to be climate vulnerable. And so the TCFD aimed to create a standardized disclosure framework, a way that we could all speak about this in a common language, that we could all say, what is a company doing on climate? What are the risks they face? How is that company being prepared for climate change? And so what they did in creating this task force and creating the recommendations was to develop 4 pillars. The 4 pillars aim to provide that comprehensive view of the firm's governance. So what are senior leadership and the board doing? Second, strategy. What are the steps that the firm is taking to integrate climate into its strategy to understand the risks that it faces and adapt strategy accordingly? Next, on a risk management approach, what are the levels of risk management that exist? What are the tools that they have at their disposal? And how are they monitoring and managing ongoing risks? And then finally, to quantify this, to give information on the data we need, on the information we need, what are some of the metrics around risk that we see? what are some of the emissions metrics, whether those are financed emissions or whether those are direct emissions. And then finally, what commitments has a firm made to improve its practices, to make green commitments, to support other broader environmental goals. And with that, then we have a framework to understand and provide clarity on what these disclosures look like. And so on the next page, I'll talk more about that, but it looks like there's a question.
We have an investment framework in Mexico for the insurance sector that's rather strict. So we are asked to invest, or we invest a lot in government bonds that are not green because they are just being created. So most of our investments are going towards the government side. So I imagine that there should be first a government change to these issuances and have more green issuances, because on the asset side we don't really have much space to move around. How do you perceive this in the world? Or you don't really see it and it's only happening in Mexico?
Yeah, so it is a reality of Mexico's security sector that a large portion of that is in government bonds, that is a significant share. And as a result, many of the insurers holding those are in some ways takers of those securities. That said, I think that the potential analyses that can be done, the understanding of building awareness within the organization, of developing more effective tools for assessing the magnitude of risks, of understanding how climate may affect some of those assets, is beneficial not only for the individual institution, but also for the larger sector as a whole. We recognize that this is in some ways a unique case, but also in other ways not. When we think another good example of this is asset managers, right? Those asset managers are managing on behalf of other people. And so as a result, the assets that may be held may be ones that they have full executive control over. In other cases, it may be ones that they are simply either custodians of, or they are managing according to an investment directive. And so in some ways, the beginning of the TCFD is really about the risk awareness and the assessment. The management, yes, in some ways may be constrained indeed by the nature of the holdings. And yes, your point though is 100% right, that the private sector and governments need to be coordinated in these efforts. And this is not only a case in Mexico, but in many cases where there are significant state-owned enterprises or significant government activities that play a major economic role. Think of countries in the Middle East as an example. It doesn't mean, though, that risks can't be assessed, that they can't be understood. And I do recognize that there are some political considerations to be made there in what we do disclose. And so I understand that that can make things more complicated. But internally, I think it benefits everyone within the organization to understand what the potential risks are, both on the transition side and the physical side of the assets you hold, whether you are bound to those or not. And maybe one last example I would give is if you imagine, say, a power producer with a number of coal plants. They probably can't shut those coal plants down tomorrow, and they probably have significant capital sunk into them. In some ways, that I think is a decent analogy for your government bonds, in the sense that it is something that is on the books. It is something that is going to be a little bit sticky, but at the same time, understanding the magnitude of the risk to say, how much should we be reserving for? How would this change over time? And what sort of strategies do we want to think about on hedging or mitigating are still going to be valuable exercises to do, whether internally or externally, even if you are somewhat bound to the asset or to the set of assets in the case of government bonds. So just to move on to exploring a little bit of what the TCFD says and what it covers. So there are 11 disclosures of the TCFD, and I think this page is a helpful reference page. It's available also on the TCFD website. Also, if you just simply Google TCFD disclosures, it will be probably the first thing that pops up. And the idea here is that the TCFD is really about building that comprehensive framework. And that framework begins, as I said, with governance. The governance piece is understanding what the board is doing on climate and understanding also what management is doing. And the reason this is so important is because executive sponsorship and because board knowledge is critical to setting the direction of the firm and setting the policies and practices that get pushed down to the rest of the organization and ultimately into the strategic pillar. So in terms of strategy, what we see is strategy is really about what risks have we identified and realizing that risks from climate manifest in the near term, 1 to 3 years, the medium term, 5 to 7 years, and then in the long term, greater than 10 years. We realize that different risks manifest in different ways at different times. And so the first step is a risk identification process. The second step then is understanding how the firm is taking climate into account in terms of its strategy. How is climate informing that strategy? What are the ways in which climate can be a motivator of new opportunities as well as a driver of potential risks? And then finally, the C pillar of the strategy, this one here, is really about strategic resilience, and that comes from assessing climate scenarios. That's going to be the focus of our discussion today around transition risk, because climate scenario analysis is probably the most important analytical component of evaluating different types of risks. On the risk management side, risk management builds on strategy by asking not only what risks are identified, but the processes for identifying those risks, then also the processes for managing those risks. So once we have identified risks, what is done about them? If a climate limit is breached, if a new business is launching that wants to go into a climate sensitive sector, what are the actions that are going on? And then most importantly, again, the C disclosure here, this last one, about how those processes of risk identification, assessment, and management fit into the larger framework. The goal here isn't to create a separate framework for climate, a separate understanding of what the overall risks are for climate, but rather a cross-cutting framework. So how does climate affect credit? How does climate affect market risks? What operational risks are created by climate change? What reputational and legal risks are created? And so how does your climate assessment fit into the broader discussion is really what the TCFD is trying to do here. And then on metrics and targets, there are 3 different classes of metrics and targets that are covered here. The first is really about risks. So what types of risk metrics? These are going to be traditional risk metrics. We've looked at a climate scenario and we've seen that losses will be this high under a 2-degree scenario, this high under a 1.5-degree scenario. These kind of analytics, we see that our portfolio, 20% of it is in climate sensitive sectors. These are the kinds of metrics that we sometimes see in this A disclosure. In B, we're talking about emissions. And so what are the direct emissions of a firm? And most importantly, for those in the room, financial institutions should be thinking about what are their financed emissions? Because as you know, you're going to have a lot more financed emissions, the emissions that come from your clients, which are your scope 3 emissions, than you are from your direct emissions. You think about the power that is keeping on lights at your office, that might be one of the main sources of direct emissions, but indirect emissions could be a loan to a coal mine, it could be an investment in a oil company, it could be the financing of carbon intensive infrastructure or industry. And then finally, this last piece, what targets have you set? What goals have you set? These don't need to be explicitly the net zero targets. They can also be green financing targets. They can also be nature related targets. They can also be pollution and waste reduction related targets. But what are the other things that you are doing to show that you are taking climate into account, seizing the opportunities that come from it, and effectively moving toward a more sustainable future? So with that in mind, those 11 disclosures are the ones within the TCFD. Now let's talk a little bit about what developments we're seeing within the TCFD. So TCFD has become a global regulatory framework, and it's been adapted by a number of regulators. It's also been adopted by hundreds of organizations within this region and thousands of organizations globally. Many financial institutions either have issued TCFD disclosures. I know for many of you in the room, either your parent company or even the subsidiary firms have issued TCFD disclosures or have plans to do climate reporting in the future. So we see a continued growth in this and a continued move toward climate as a standard across the world and within regions. We also see it really as an area that people are improving their skills, improving their knowledge. And so when we talk about how do we compare to our competitors, I want to point out a few areas where climate disclosures have improved over the last few years. The first of these is starting with the governance area. So you can see back in 2017 when the TCFD was first issued, very few organizations were making disclosures about governance. Now we're getting around 25% doing that. And I think that that number is still way too low because, as I said, governance really is the beginning of your disclosure journey. It's the beginning of your risk management approach because senior leadership buy-in is so important to setting the direction of the firm. Another thing we see is that one of the toughest disclosures to make is around strategy and specifically around scenario analysis. And importantly, what we can see here is that in this case, this is going to be the focus of today's work and today's session, which is going to be helping you understand climate scenarios and with the Oliver Wyman team talking about what climate scenario analysis looks like. Now, as far as improvements go across the board, what we're seeing is more firms are willing to make quantitative disclosures. We're seeing those double or even triple in frequency. And as a result, what we're seeing is a number of developments going on. We're seeing more peer companies beginning to make disclosures. So for those that haven't, looking around you, more and more of your peers will have done this. We're also seeing not only are these disclosures mainstream, but they're also tying in more closely and more explicitly to what types of activities a firm undertakes. So when it comes to evaluating a new deal, when it comes to setting terms for a new loan, these are places now uniquely that previously weren't covered by climate, but now climate disclosures are becoming a new source of information. And this is exactly the vision of the TCFD. This is exactly the desire, which is to bring about an overall view that the TCFD itself is a way to provide new information on these important topics. We also see a large increase, as I said, in the number of disclosures, and we're also seeing prices and valuations of financial assets being affected by climate information, whether that's real assets being affected by physical risks, whether that's write-downs in the potential for stranded assets due to transition risks. We're seeing these things begin to have an effect. And I think that that is something that's also been noticed by the regulatory community. And as a result, regulators are also taking some of the first steps to begin mandating this in a number of areas across the world. A few examples here that I think are helpful to hear a little bit about the global perspective before we dive more specifically into Mexico is to see that we have international organizations like the IFRS Foundation putting together a climate disclosure prototype. We also see organizations internationally building off the TCFD. We see, using Europe as an example, this idea that the European Central Bank has set the expectation that climate disclosure is not only necessary, but good climate disclosure is critical to the functioning of effective financial markets and critical to the expectations that supervisors set out for those that they supervise. Within Britain, we've seen that disclosure requirements have been made mandatory. The TCFD has been required over the last couple years, and further guidance has been issued on transition plans. Transition plans are a way that a firm talks about how it reaches a sustainable future, how it moves from a high carbon organization to a lower carbon one. And so it is an important component related to TCFD disclosures. So these are a few of the areas, as you can see, where regulatory requirements are beginning to come about. To mention a few other important developments, from a regulatory standpoint, starting within Mexico and Latin America and building out, one of the most important developments is around climate stress testing. Some regions are not yet calling it climate stress testing. Some of them instead are calling it climate scenario analysis. But fundamentally, sorry, I went back. Fundamentally, the exercise here is about understanding what climate scenarios look like, understanding what impacts they might have for financial actors, and understanding how the real economy is ready for these changes. And so what we saw at COP27 was a greater expectation in emissions reduction from Mexico, which means that there's going to be more pressure on the transition side. We also see that the central bank is working on understanding physical risks and continuing through research that, as you heard Francisco talk about yesterday, understanding what this means across different states within the country, across different industries. These are some of the main developments here. Within other Latin American countries, we also see within Chile, a series of stress testing exercises within their monetary and financial agency. We also see that within Brazil, stress testing developments are ongoing, and Colombia has worked with the IMF explicitly to develop a transition risk stress test. And we're seeing more and more not only mandated disclosures, but development of stress testing. Globally, what we see is within Europe, climate stress testing has already become a main expectation of most nations within the continent. Within the US, Canada has run a stress testing exercise, or sorry, within North America, outside of Mexico, Canada has run a stress testing exercise. The US Federal Reserve has announced plans to do so themselves this coming year. And across Africa, we see Kenya has required climate disclosures. South Africa has done a physical risk stress test. And in other regions, we're seeing between Singapore, China, Hong Kong, and Australia, stress tests that have also been run. And I would highly recommend looking at some of the outcomes, some of the results of those tests to understand not only what firms in those countries have been asked to do, but also what learnings have come from that, as well as what methodologies have been most common, what data limitations have existed, as well as the scenarios used. And what you'll find is that a lot of those scenarios are going to be ones that are related to some of the ones we'll talk about today, especially those of the network for greening the financial system, which I'll speak about in just a few minutes. So if stress testing is becoming a bigger feature and scenario analysis is becoming more important, we can see this also reflected in the fact that more and more countries are now requiring climate disclosures and are setting expectations for what those disclosures will look like. This is one of the big areas of development that we continue to see, both from the US to Brazil, from Australia to Spain, from France to Hong Kong. There are a number of jurisdictions requiring climate disclosures, and even more of them that are beginning to consider, even if it's not required, using the TCFD framework as good practice. And so, as you can see here, the benefit of this means that if you're working as part of a multinational corporation, the disclosures that you're doing in one place will be increasingly comparable and relevant to those coming from subsidiaries and from other companies as well. And so that is one of the important points that I would note here, is that the regulatory expectations are both rising with TCFD support, but also with requirements on disclosures. And so those will come relatively quickly and relatively soon in a number of new regulations, both on securities disclosures, as well as on disclosures from central banks. So as I said, I wanted to now conclude this part of our discussion with a coverage of a few different resources that I think are really important in shaping the international discussion on climate disclosures, and on what we should be thinking about. The first of these is the Network on Greening the Financial System. This is a group of nearly 120 global supervisors, central banks from around the world, many within the region, including the Mexican Central Bank. These are organizations focused on developing methodologies, approaches, and areas to better disclose climate risks, to better conduct scenario analysis, to understand how to integrate sustainability considerations into supervision. And so as a result, there are a number of working groups that they've developed and led. There is a work stream on supervision, looking at what kind of requirements and regulations are most effective, building global coherence. There's also scenario design and analysis. This is going to be the main focus today. We're going to talk about those scenarios, help understand what they are. There's also one on monetary policy. So what can central banks do to encourage the transition, to manage and mitigate financial risks? Then there is a move on what does the transition look like for central banks? What does net zero commitment mean? How do we get to that net zero? And then finally, there are two important task forces, one exploring nature and the other developing capacity and training for organizations. And so the NGFS, ngfs.net is their website. They've developed not only climate scenarios that we'll talk about today, but they've also developed a number of resources that are quite valuable for understanding how supervisors are really thinking about the climate challenge. In addition to the NGFS, there's also the work of the IFRS Foundation, as I mentioned. At COP26 in Glasgow, the IFRS Foundation launched the International Sustainability Standards Board. And what the International Sustainability Standards Board aims to do is provide a common language for sustainability disclosures, not just climate disclosures, but disclosures across the board for other broader sustainability and ESG related considerations. They've recently issued some interesting and relevant guidance that will be informing how stress testing, how disclosures take place. They also will be providing guidance on what good practices look like. And in doing so, they've taken the TCFD and they've taken the framework there and expanded it with further guidance. So I'll talk about that in a minute, but what is helpful to know is many of the sustainability standards organizations that you've come to know over the years, SASB as one, the CDSB, the GRI, all of them now either are explicitly part of ISSB or are contributing members to it. So this is giving us a common language across our sustainability disclosures to no longer say, oh, you disclose under GRI, I have a TCFD report. How do those connect to each other? The goal now is to say with the ISSB that these are global standards. These are global ways that we can begin to understand what disclosures are sensible to make and how we can begin then to better compare and assess what disclosures mean in terms of the actual risks and opportunities they provide about a firm, rather than focusing on you used method A, we used method B. And so to begin that coherence, to begin that connection, there are a number of important steps that the ISSB has taken. Some of those steps include the development of a structure for focusing on disclosures. That structure begins by using the TCFD. The second is expecting that companies should disclose financially material information that comes from climate risks and opportunities. So if your business is changing, if you are exposed to risks, the expectation now is that that is good practice to disclose. Also, we are going to talk, as I said today, a lot about scenario analysis. That's going to be our main focus. But scenario analysis now is no longer an optional element as it has been for some regulators, but rather something that the ISSB requires. Another thing that it requires are scope 3 emissions. And scope 3 emissions are so important because, as I said, for a financial firm, you might only be accounting for 10% of your emissions if you look at direct emissions. Your financed emissions, the investments you hold, the money that you provide in loans and bonds, these may be the major elements of your carbon footprint. And so they need to be taken into account. And then finally, creating this idea of interoperability. As different regulators come up with ideas for disclosures, for stress tests, how do they speak to each other? How can we compare across? And so focusing deeply on that is one of the key elements that the ISSB aims to do. So with that, these are some of the big developments. The ISSB around COP27 posed some new guidance, some new recommendations that it adopted. So what I would recommend is looking both at the ISSB webpage, the NGFS webpage, as well as that of the TCFD. All three of those are going to provide the latest and greatest practices on climate disclosure, how supervisors are thinking about climate, and broader sustainability standards across the world. So I think we have a few minutes before we're supposed to take our break. So wanted to share with you an opportunity to ask questions. And if there are questions in the Zoom, please let me know as well.
Thank you. Good morning. I have a question on the net zero commitments of banks or financial institutions in general. Because if you have like one company that you are trying to assess that they're going to go to net zero, but you're not the only one who is financing them, but you don't know who else is financing them, how do you calculate how much of those emissions can be attached or attached to your loan?
So the standard currently on that probably is most universally adopted and used is part of the Partnership on Carbon Accounting Financials, also known as PCAF. So when it comes to wholesale loans, they have a specific methodology, and they have a methodology that aims to attribute your share of the overall outstanding. And that can be based on the enterprise value of the company. It can be based on total outstanding debt. And those pieces of information are then available from sources like DealLogic, from S&P and others. But what I would recommend is if you look at the PCAF methodology, it's not actually terribly complicated, but the idea of calculating financed emissions is really about creating a prorated share of the emissions you're responsible for based on your financial contribution to that company's operation. And so that can be done on an equity side, that can be done also on a debt side as well. And even if you don't know necessarily the other parties involved, as long as there's information on the outstanding, that will allow that calculation. And if there isn't, then there are a number of fallback methodologies that are related to things such as overall market size, that are also related to economic intensity of activities, so you can build from the ground up. So what share of revenue is accounted for, and what relationship does that have to the financing you're providing? Is there something project specific? So is this ring fenced to a specific project? And as a result, are the emissions associated exclusively with that project rather than with the firm as a whole? These are all considerations that can be discussed and covered using the PCAF methodology. And just to mention, though, that is an evolving methodology. It's one that is continuing to develop, and one that inputs from organizations like yours helps to make it better, because we know that there are a number of different financial products. There are different relationships between ownership stakes, between lenders, and the diversity of financial products that companies may use. So getting this attribution right is an evolving process. But I would say the best single source at present for understanding financed emissions calculation is through that Partnership on Carbon Accounting Financials, also known as PCAF. Sure.
Hi. Does the TCFD consider any disclosure on social metrics, like to have the whole ESG vision of a company?
So TCFD doesn't cover social metrics because it focuses relatively exclusively on climate. However, there's some evidence that its vision and mandate is somewhat expanding. And within the ISSB, within their overall disclosures, there is a general requirements prototype that covers broader sustainability related concerns. So things such as the S and the G within ESG. TCFD itself was focused on climate. And as a result, that's why one of the related initiatives, the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, has been created to broaden the perspective of that E from just the climate side to fully include nature. But when it comes to wider sustainability disclosures, I would look at the ISSB's general prototype. I would also look, as a good example, at some of the work that has come out now in Europe on what is called the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, because that focuses not just on a single element such as climate, but more widely. And so TCFD, I think, is a versatile framework. If you're thinking about social risks, thinking about governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets, still is a very sensible framework. But the TCFD, as far as commenting on those things, tends to be a little bit more explicitly climate focused. So there's nothing wrong with including that, but it may be something that tends to be from a private organization included in your sustainability report rather than, say, within TCFD reporting. But it's a good question because it does show the focus of TCFD versus the broader sustainability discussion.
Gracias, David. ¿En qué metodología?
Which methodology or how are you analyzing market risks and goodwill, and how to integrate risk analysis in these two types of transition risks?
So as far as that goes, considering the ways to integrate different types of risks, market risks, credit risks, and bring transition risk in, what I would say is transition risk is cross-cutting for many firms. So if a firm is exposed to transition risk, as we talked about yesterday, that transition risk can come from policies that make that firm have to face higher expenses or limit the revenue generating activities they can do. They also, on the technology side, may face stiffer competition that can affect pricing and affect margins. They also may see market shifts. Those market shifts can affect the cost of capital. They can also affect overall consumer demand and thus revenues. And then finally, at the heart of it, in terms of reputational impacts, there's also the potential that transition risks can make a company less valuable by reducing things such as brand and goodwill elements that you mentioned within the question. So those are a few of the ways that transition risks can cross-cut into other types of risks through the different elements that we had laid out yesterday and will now be discussing in more detail over the course of today.
Tengo una duda en respecto a.
I have one question regarding the PCAF that you mentioned. Upon analyzing, we face issue in finding information for state-owned companies, which in Mexico are very important, like the CFE, which is a federal power company, and PEMEX, and they have important issues regarding engagement and carbon emissions. And therefore, this creates a bias because we rather focus on private companies that could have this type of emissions. So how can we adapt the PCAF regarding this type of companies? And then there's another question regarding investments through a diversified portfolio. We have some indirect investments in different companies around the world, and they don't necessarily all disclose information. So how can we generate some engagement with these companies? Because it is not as easy to engage with them as it is with local companies.
Yeah, so I'll start with the first question first on state-owned enterprises and say that the PCAF approach has a number of fallback methodologies. So if direct emissions information isn't available, then economic intensity and physical intensity measures can be used. So an example of this would be, let's say we're looking at a state-owned oil company. We can use PEMEX as the example here. If we don't have a disclosure of PEMEX's emissions, we can then think about that in a couple different ways. We can first think about that by looking Mexico as a signatory to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, compiles and submits a global emissions registry on an annual basis. That registry does break things out into sectors, and knowing if a sector is state-owned, that the emissions attributable in that sector should be then assigned to the particular company, the state-owned enterprise that is producing them. However, that may not always be the case because depending on the quality of that registry, that information may or may not be in there. However, as I said, PCAF has these fallback methodologies, and those fallback methodologies, now let's use that example. We don't have the information on what the total tons of emissions are, but we do know how many barrels of oil PEMEX produces, and we do know what share we are of providing financing. Based on intensity measures calculated by organizations like the International Energy Agency and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we can say, based on that, assuming the typical extraction in Mexico, the average per barrel is about 25 kilos or 400 kilos or whatever the number is, and we can then scale that up. In other cases, we may not even have that information. I would say almost all of the time when it comes to heavy industry, you will have that intensity-based information and you will have proxies that can be used. But when you don't, you can then think about economic value added of what share of the total is accountable based on this economic value. So if we're providing this much in debt financing and the overall revenues are as such, we can use a question of per million pesos per ton of emissions, what is the economic value? And then if we don't have that, then we can finally, as a last fallback, go to an idea of comparables to say, based on this, we know that we do have a private company that we finance, and that private company has intensity of emissions of X. We know that this state-owned enterprise is 20 times larger. So knowing nothing else, we're going to have to go with the assumption that its emissions are 20 times higher unless we have good evidence otherwise. So unfortunately, there's not a perfect solution of kind of magically getting information that isn't necessarily available, but there are data sources. Many of the big data providers have now launched specifically climate products because of the recognized demand for this. In many cases, those products, and kind of this moves a little bit into your second question, are going to be biased a little bit more toward bigger companies, toward public companies, which means that the proxy-based methodologies may need to be used more frequently when it comes to smaller companies or companies where disclosures are lacking. What I would say on the second point is this is why climate disclosure standards and initiatives like the ISSB are so valuable, because the idea is across different jurisdictions, setting the expectation that organizations need to report across all scopes of emissions will make life easier for you to engage, because then it doesn't become a question of why is such and such business asking us for more information, but rather this is the expectation. And so similarly, if you imagine a company that didn't give you financial statements, that would be problematic. But now, because of regulatory requirements, security expectations from securities regulators, that information is available to everyone. So in many cases, this problem is one that will get better through the increased adoption of climate risk disclosure mandates. But what I would also say is when it comes to engagement, understanding that by using proxies, it gives others the incentive to then really measure and manage their own disclosures. Because if you say, we'll use this as your proxy because that's the best we know, they may say, no, we're much more efficient than that. And then for you, I think the next engagement strategy is to say, well, show us, we need to see verified and reported emissions, either from you or from a third party. Otherwise, we're going to have to go with that fallback assumption. And so in some ways, I think both the mandate to disclose as well as the use of proxies can encourage companies that maybe aren't yet publishing or sharing their emissions data to do a better job of doing so in the future. And I think another element, of course, is related to contingent financing. If we have a net zero plan and we don't know what companies in our portfolio are doing, we know that we're not going to be able to pursue our plan without getting that knowledge. And so understanding that once you've made that strategic commitment to decarbonizing, it becomes then important to press those companies if they want to be continuing their relationship with you in order to provide that information, or at least provide a proxy estimate that will allow you to complete that. So again, there's no perfect solutions in this space, because while there are many data sources, while there are proxy approaches, and we can talk about all of those, the goal really is to create a regime across the world that provides standardized data, that provides standardized information, and creates the right incentives for you and your clients to get that disclosure information that you need. Other questions?
From Zoom.
Yeah, so one Zoom question, then we'll go to the in-person question.
So this question says from Lucia, how will the federal supplier climate risks and resilience rule, I guess from the White House, is linked to the TCFD, and how will affect Mexican companies that supplies directly or indirectly to the US?
Yeah, so great question. So one of the big announcements, the US government made a number of announcements in parallel to COP27, with one of the biggest being this one that kind of floated below the radar because it's somewhat technical and somewhat involved in government procurement. But it might not surprise you to know that the US government is the biggest purchaser of services in the world. You would expect that with a budget of a few $1 trillion annually, that they're spending quite a lot of money, and procurement for contracting is a significant component. So what this rule says, for those that aren't as familiar, is that companies that are going to provide services to the United States federal government are going to be required to have climate information and climate disclosures with information both about their transition plans and also information about their climate risks. And so what does this mean for Mexican companies that are in the procurement space, Mexican companies in the services sector working with the US government? It means that for them, having a climate disclosure and a transition plan are now an essential part of doing business, in the same way that in the past, you might have had to fill out a long supplier form on questions of security, questions of confidentiality. Now, this is a new expectation and requirement. And this is, I think, a good example of the US federal government, through executive action, throwing its weight around with the idea that if you are a big company, a big consultancy, a big supplier, the US government may not be your only client, but it might be a big enough client that this will make disclosures required, not only for their businesses, but across all of your other work as well. And so part of the goal here is trying to use that bully pulpit of the White House to make these disclosures required, with the idea that it's going to be harder to pass certain things in a very divided US Congress. And so that's one of the main areas that I would say the law will affect, or rather, not really a law, a executive action will affect. Good question here.
En español, de nuevo.
Sí.
Now, talking about insurance companies, for instance, we insure oil and gas, their losses, their civil and environmental accountability, everything should bring some disclosure with it. And maybe we should also increase prices due to the environmental risk that they have. What do you think about this? Or just get rid of that investment because we would be having these reputational risks that might become even more expensive for the company?
Yeah, this fundamentally gets at the heart of how financial institutions engage with the question of the climate transition. And it's to say that there's not a perfect answer or an easy answer, but my vision is really widespread client engagement with high emitters that really leaves all options on the table. A lot of people say, don't divest. Divestment will just lead to those assets going somewhere else, to someone who doesn't care, or don't just engage because engagement is just a free pass for a company to continue emitting. I think the answer is somewhere in between, which is to say, in your engagement, if you are a company, a financial firm that wants to be sustainable, that wants to get to net zero, then your requirement is to leave all options on the table, to say, our goal first is to help our clients that we have relationships with transition, because we are better positioned than anyone else to support that transition. But for companies that can't transition or won't transition, we need to leave the option on the table to potentially exit those relationships. Because if we don't leave that option on the table, then there's no pressure behind any of our other engagement actions, because we know that for those companies, it will just be status quo, that they will continue to receive financing from us, to receive underwriting from us, to receive insurance coverage from us. And so it does need to exist on a case-by-case basis. Some oil and gas companies are justifiably making transitions. Others are some of the lowest emissions producers in the sector. And others are conducting activities that not only have climate impacts, but also other environmental impacts. And it will depend a little bit on each of those to know what the company's transition plan is, what their transition prospects are, and then what role you should have in engaging with them. I think it's often easier to say, we'll just exit this relationship. but I think that it is the need to consider what leverage you have over that company and what change you can be potentially responsible for creating through engagement. That is the first step. Then it may be the case, as I said, that those companies may be reducing their business, may be potentially not viable in a future economy, or may not be aligned to your vision of what a sustainable insurance firm looks like for you. And so it is on a case-by-case basis, but what I would say my biggest piece of recommendation to anyone confronting this challenge is to say fundamentally, we need to keep all options on the table and to let companies know that we're serious, both about our commitments as well as about helping them transition. And the companies that can't or won't transition, unfortunately, are not going to have a place in that longer future because of the fact that they are not going to be compatible with that low carbon and sustainable vision we have for our own firm.
We are currently measuring through the temperature increase, but it's not the same an increase from 14 to 15 degrees than from 40 to 41 degrees. Also, geography is very important to understand the impact and the damage to biodiversity. So regarding this metric of temperature increase, have you thought about how else could these metrics would be, or what other options for metrics could be? And second question, the countries that are seeing these radical changes in temperature might then, as a consequence, generate more emissions. And when they finally decide to take action, it might be too late.
So I think those questions focus a little bit more on some of the physical risk considerations. In the discussion that we've just had today, while implied temperature rise can be a useful way of communicating how aligned or misaligned a country's activities are or a company's activities are to a low carbon future, it's not the only piece of information. And it may be that the negative impacts in one country may be significantly different because not only may warming be higher, but also because moving from, say, a level of maximal agricultural productivity to one where there is a steep drop off in that productivity can be more economically damaging. And so that's why we think information such as overall emissions across all scopes, direct emission scope 1, indirect scope 2, and then supply chain or life cycle emissions scope 3 are important information to disclose both for countries as well as businesses. We also think that it's important to explore risk measures, things such as the likelihood of severe events, tail risks, and understand the potential damages, because those will be occurring on a local level and will be a little bit related to the temperature rise, but independent of that. So the damage you may see in one state within Mexico that has the same level of temperature rise as another one that is warmer or cooler, you may see different hazards and different damages. And that's why I think it's important to start with the underlying hazards and consider the impacts and negative harms that they create. On the second question about increasing emissions, what I would say is, I think it's less likely that countries that are severely affected are going to be able to rapidly increase emissions, because often the economic disruption limits the construction of infrastructure. What I think is more frequent is countries that are developing, that are saying we need to build climate resilience today, are going to be then investing in climate in solutions that are high carbon. So we need regular energy supplies. Maybe we build a coal plant. We need to build dams and infrastructure. We maybe use a lot of cement to do that. You're seeing these examples on a macro scale within China as an example of this. That said, I think that it creates what we would call carbon lock-in, and it's something we're eager to avoid, which is the potential that climate not only gets worse, but also that we choose a development path of high emissions and of assets that will have long lives where they continue to emit. So part of the goal is creating the conditions, and this is what the Paris Agreement aims to do, of technology transfer, of financial support that avoids those lock-ins, that enables countries and other states and jurisdictions to find low carbon alternatives to promote both resiliency and development. And so that really is one of the main focuses. It's why adaptation finance is so important. It's why the technology transfer, which is in Articles 10 and 9 and 10 of the Paris Agreement, are so important. But it's because that knowledge sharing, that ability to push these technologies down the cost curve, will make them more competitive and avoid that longer term lock-in of fossil fuels. I think there was one more question in the back, maybe.
Buenos días. Suponiendo que existe un evento.
Let's say that there is an event that makes a company in which I am investing has a reputation or technological issues. How can I measure the correlation between this event and the price of the financial assets?
So this is one of the areas where there's a number of ongoing academic research studies as well as empirical studies. It's actually one that we, as part of UNEP-FI, are undertaking with some researchers, which is what price is paid for high carbon assets? How much are firms really pricing in the carbon transition or not? But one of the areas I would direct you to is the TCFD's 2022 status report. It has a whole section on the relationship between climate risks and pricing, and a number of those explore the relationship between transition risks and pricing as well. So those studies, I think, are some of the first indications of what signals are emerging from that noise of climate disclosures, of climate risks, and of asset pricing. But beyond that, what I would suggest is, in developing models and approaches, identifying an intuitive business relationship between the pressures posed by climate change or the climate transition on the financials of the business, and thus updating the asset price accordingly. So as I said, I would start with some of those academic studies to see the relationships, but I would also think about what are the mechanisms. And when the Oliver Wyman team talks about some of the driver-based financial modeling for transition risk, you'll see what they're talking about in terms of impacts on revenue, impacts on costs, and how those may affect either asset prices or credit risks. So any questions from the Zoom, and maybe just because I know we're running a bit over and we want to get to our break. Okay, so let's do the Zoom questions first, and then we'll do the live question, and then I think we can take a break after those. Great.
Thank you, David. This is from Dr. Dania Punoli. Is it possible to assess and manage transitional risk in more informal primary sector, like small or marginal rice farms, as methane emissions is more there? How can they transform?
So I think that this is a challenge, especially the smaller the business is. But I think that when it comes to such exposures, this is a good example where elements like carbon pricing can be a good proxy for the potential additional costs that are faced, and especially if those are established as a national standard or are used in the analysis, we can get a sense of what the associated costs would be. A good example of this might be just, not building a model here right up on the stage, but just to talk through the example. If we look at rice farmers with methane emissions, and we can say per ton of rice produced, methane emissions are X. Now we convert those into carbon dioxide equivalent, and we say per ton of rice produced, 1 ton of CO2 emissions, just as an example, is produced. So now we've converted the methane into CO2. Assuming there aren't any additional policy restrictions on methane release, then we can say, at given carbon prices, what are the additional associated costs? And then from there, we can say, what, from an elasticity standpoint for foodstuffs and specifically rice within that market, what is the elasticity of that? With the idea that if that elasticity is high, we know that the higher costs that are faced are going to relate to higher prices, but then also reduce demand. If elasticity is low, what we're going to see is that more of those prices will be passed along to the consumer with less of a constriction in demand. So we can then potentially update the financial health of those potential smaller borrowers by using different carbon price levels as assumptions to say, this is the global average carbon price. This is what has been assumed as the social cost of carbon, so the negative impacts from climate change based on carbon price. This is what this state or this region says is the price. All of those are different ways that we can kind of think about that and build, in this case, a simple model that then can be elaborated by adding on more assumptions and using statistical techniques to parameterize them. So I think one last question, maybe over on this side of the room.
Hola, hola, buenos días. Retomando un poco la pregunta
So,
al inicio de la sesión.
picking up a little bit the question that was made at the beginning of the session and regarding the financial framework affectations, the banking system in Mexico has a strong regulatory load, and they need to invest in some assets to cover the capitalization index or other factors. Do you have any comparison of the ratings of these funds or these green assets compared to the market? Where I'm going is the bank and their investments, and in order for them to cover over these bonds, they would have to invest in them. And to promote the green banking, we would need to look at these assets. I don't know if there is a comparison when it comes to liquid assets or where to check this.
So I think one area that may be an interesting area to look at is because within Europe, there's been developments in reporting standards on different types of funds and different types of assets according to their green taxonomy. And so one thing is to use a existing taxonomy, say like the EU taxonomy, to look at relative asset pricing between activities that are covered by the taxonomy as well as activities that fall outside of it. Another is to consider some of the studies that have been done relating the price of green assets, the idea, especially in the bond market, of a greenium, the potential for assets that are green to have lower capital costs and potential for higher returns. Some work in that space has been done by the Climate Bonds Initiative, looking at some of the impacts in the bond market. There's also some academic studies exploring some of the relationship, say, between green assets and non-green assets. The area I might suggest looking at within the EU, as I talked about the taxonomy, is their green asset ratio, looking at funds and assets that fall within the green assets of the green asset ratio versus those that fall outside of it. So just maybe a couple of suggestions on how to begin looking at that and kind of seeing what others have been exploring in that same space. Great. So I think now would be a good time for us to take a little break. Why don't we take a break for coffee, for a snack, and reconvene at 10 a.m. We'll be back here, and then we'll really go into our deep dive, both of transition scenarios, but also our scenario exercise, where we'll have some of you use the Menti polling to share your answers with the wider group anonymously and see what your peers are thinking about climate risks, about at-risk sectors, and what scenarios make the most sense to you. All right, so as people just come back to their seats, we'll get started again, because there's a good number of things to cover over the discussion around transition scenarios. And I think that will help set us up really well for the exercises that we do together, as well as the afternoon exercise and discussion of transition risk methodology with Oliver Wyman. So the first thing that I would say is that there are really a number of important use cases for climate scenarios within the financial sector. These extend to not only disclosures, as we were talking about, the TCFD disclosures, climate scenario analysis, but also in more depth, the assessment of risk for individual counterparties, so risk ratings, client engagement strategies. Also, it can inform overarching strategy for the firm, as well as updating things such as limits, internal risk appetite. It can also be used to meet internal and external regulatory demands. But as you'll see over the next few pages, there are a number of different applications of climate scenarios and specifically transition scenarios that we see. So I'll talk through a few of these here. The first one is in TCFD disclosure. This is an example from UBS looking specifically at a number of activities that they've undertaken with regard to climate scenarios in their disclosures. And so TCFD disclosure and external as well as internal reporting is one of the main functions of scenario analysis. This can be using short-term scenarios, it can be doing qualitative assessments, and it can also be looking at more quantitative analysis in order to conduct scenarios. So I know that the text is kind of small, but just to show here a few of the things that were done working with my program. We explored climate scenarios from a variety of different providers. Also, more recently, they worked with the IEA as well as a number of other scenario providers to understand climate risks and then to disclose those climate risks as part of the TCFD. And as I mentioned previously, that disclosure C of strategy on the TCFD provides a really important focus for climate disclosure and climate strategy, which is around scenario analysis. And so that C disclosure asks firms to assess the resilience of their strategy against a scenario, and often the results of that can then be reported in that section or within the metrics and targets for the firm. Another area where scenarios can be effectively used is in conducting internal risk assessment and analysis. That internal risk assessment and analysis can focus on beginning with the models themselves, understanding what the key variables are. So the Oliver Wyman team will talk in a lot more detail about how they develop these linkages. What then can be done is a projection of climate-related scenarios onto financial statements. So an example of this would be if we looked at carbon price and the carbon price comes from the scenario model, then that carbon price is passed on as a cost to an energy producer. So then on the income statement, one of the additional costs is going to be that additional cost of carbon pricing. And so we can update the financial statements according to elements within the scenario. So essentially, these are what we call scenario adjusted outcomes or scenario adjusted statements. You can do this similarly as well with market risk assessment. So looking at the growth of an industry, how much demand is there for energy within a particular sector from a particular source, so maybe natural gas. Then we can look at a growth rate of the overall natural gas sector based on the change over time from the scenario. And then we can make projections about future profitability of the companies as well as overall size of the market. And so there are a number of ways we can use scenario data. And what we'll be doing in a lot more depth, both in the second half of this presentation, in our exercise, and in the afternoon, is really covering what this actually looks like in practice. Another area, though, for scenario analysis is in target setting, and specifically looking at the breakdown of different targets and looking at how a pathway can be created. So, for example, the International Energy Agency, they've developed a number of pathways, and those pathways are ones that help inform how the transportation sector decarbonizes, how the energy sector decarbonizes, how the industrial sector decarbonizes. And by doing that, we can have clear pathways along the way that show how quickly we as a financial company need to see our clients reduce emissions, how quickly we can move away from financing high emitting companies and into low carbon ones. So the transition scenarios can give us a transition pathway that we can base our goals off. So that's another potential use and application of the transition scenarios that I wanted to mention here. They can also be used to say at a given point, what are the emissions reductions seen? Because the scenarios will tell us, okay, for industrials by 2030, emissions have been reduced by 40%, by 2040 by 70%. And that can then, as I said, become that pathway that we use when we're setting our strategy, when we're engaging with clients, and when we're making our commitments. Finally, as we discussed in the regulatory session, one of the big areas where we see the use of climate scenarios is to meet regulatory demands and specifically regulatory disclosures. This example from the Bank of England shows the creation of scenarios used for climate stress testing and what those scenarios look like. So what those scenarios include is information about the different types of risks, so level of transition risks, level of physical risks, when a transition begins, what the transition's attributes are. We'll talk more about these attributes in a few minutes. What the carbon price is, what the overall temperature is, and these become then parameters that can be used in building climate risk models on how severe are physical effects, how much pressure is put on companies based on the carbon price. All of these are different elements where a scenario can be used to conduct stress testing and can be developed for the purpose of seeing how firms prepare with that future world that is being considered. So rather than disclosing, rather than focusing on individual counterparties, rather than setting targets, we can think holistically as a firm about what that scenario means for us. So those are just a few of the applications of scenarios. As you can see, that's a fairly diverse set, and there are many new ones and new approaches that are being developed really on a fairly frequent basis for how we can get better insights using climate scenarios. But what I wanted to do now is talk about a number of the important climate scenarios that exist, because these are ones I think that you will become increasingly familiar with if you're not already, in understanding where the climate scenarios are developed, who developed them, and what types of scenarios they are. And so the first bunch here, these three, called Remind, Message, and GCAM, are ones produced by the Potsdam Institute, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, called YASA, and the Pacific Northwest National Laboratories, or the University of Maryland. These three are what are called integrated assessment models, and we're going to talk in a lot of detail over the next part of our session about what integrated assessment models mean. But these are the three that since 2019 have been working with the network on greening the financial system to develop their reference scenarios. There are other integrated assessment models. These are hardly the only ones, and many of them are submitted to the IPCC, specifically to Working Group 3, to explore what mitigation pathways exist. Another popular one is the image model from PBL, which is in the Netherlands. And then probably another one of the best known modeling providers is the International Energy Agency. There are two big models that they tend to produce. One is the World Energy Model, sometimes called WEM. This is often included in their World Energy Outlook. There's also the Energy Technology Perspectives, which is a bit of a deeper dive into energy supply and demand from a bottom-up perspective. Both of these are used by companies to set net zero targets, as well as in TCFD disclosures as well. So if we had to kind of consider two main sources of big energy systems models that we see, we tend to see mostly this group of three, the NGFS models and the IEA models are the most common. However, those aren't the only things we need to know about climate change. We also want to understand what economic developments come about. How does the short-term changes take place within a transition? And this is why macroeconomic models are so important. And so the NGFS since 2021 has been working with the National Institute for Economic and Social Research in the United Kingdom, also known as NICER. And they have a model which is an economic model that looks at short-term shocks. So elements such as a sudden carbon price, elements such as a trade war due to carbon taxation in one area versus another, as well as a number of other shocks. There's also a model called G-Cubed. The NGFS did a workshop with G-Cubed and did some analysis on how G-Cubed could give more granularity to the economic indicators such as gross value added, or GVA, within different sectors. So just to say that there's a number of macroeconomic models that also can be used for climate change. We're going to spend most of our time today talking about the big models, these energy systems models or integrated assessment models, but I want you to be aware that often these models work in conjunction and connection with the bigger models, because having those macroeconomic drivers is likely to be relevant for the financial impacts and implications. A few other important models that you may come across in the asset manager and asset owner community. The One Earth climate model is a particularly conservative model that looks at how do we get to net zero without using removals, without using much nuclear, really focused on 100% renewables. And it's an approach that is being used by the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, a group of asset owners convened by the UN that is working to decarbonize their portfolios, working to get to net zero. So this is the model of reference that they use. There's also models like En-ROADS and C-ROADS. En-ROADS is a really enjoyable and insightful tool. It's a great communication tool, so I highly recommend taking a look at it. It's an initiative between MIT, Ventana, and a couple others that focuses on really specifically what you can understand about different pathways and how different sectors react. It's not a risk-based model. It's not going to produce variables, but it will produce visualizations of the impacts on temperature, the impacts on carbon price, and I think it's a really helpful communication tool. Finally, there are a number of in-house scenarios built. Your organizations may be building in-house scenarios, and while that sounds ambitious given the climate modeling and climate science that goes into climate, on the other hand, it's not so different than what firms have been doing since the global financial crisis in defining risk scenarios for them to better understand and understanding not only their own idiosyncratic risks, but how those risks might interact with the wider economy. And so the energy companies have been probably the first to do this, given how central energy, carbon emissions, and fossil fuels are to their business. So some of the earliest scenario models that we've had on energy systems have come from organizations like BP and Shell. They still produce these scenarios. You can look at them. A number of them are open source and public, but they also go to show that scenario development doesn't need to be developed purely by academics, by research institutes, but also can be developed at a company level. We're not going to talk as much about scenario development itself. We're going to talk more about existing scenarios, their components, what we can and can't know from our scenarios, and what some of the benefits and limitations of using scenarios are within our discussion. But that still means that I think there's a really good opportunity for us to better understand what the key components are, because by understanding those key components, we can better integrate the outputs into our risk models. So as I said, the main focus that I want to have us spend our time on, because I think it'll set us up well for the discussion with Oliver Wyman, is really the integrated assessment models. Climate scenarios that we look at on the transition side are really derived from integrated assessment models. These are models that really focus on helping to understand how the whole system fits together. So the climate system, how warm the planet is getting. The land system, how is land use changing in terms of agriculture, in terms of forestry? How are energy systems changing? So how much energy is demanded in this sector or that? What are the economic developments that are going on that are making the world wealthier, that are making it demand more in terms of energy and outputs? And realizing that any model of the world is not going to be a model of one system, but multiple systems. So integrated assessment models, as the name suggests, integrate across a variety of pieces of information, elements of the socioeconomic futures of the planet, look at elements such as energy demand and energy mix, look at required investment to reach certain outcomes. And by putting all those pieces together, you see cross dependencies. And those dependencies are powerful as a way to understand real world implications. And what I mean there is that if we have a faster growing world, we're likely going to need more energy to provide for that world. If we have a world that is emitting more, then we're going to see more impacts on the climate side. If we see a world that is decarbonizing, then we're going to see emissions fall. Just like in the real world, we can't fully disentangle all of the elements of climate change and all of the elements of the economy from each other. We need to recognize that in a linked system, there are going to be these codependencies. And it's these dependencies that make these models so interesting and useful, because by considering each of these components, considering an energy system, a land system, climate, and an economy, we can put in information about how quickly we believe population growth rate comes in, what new technologies are most likely to develop, what are policy instruments such as carbon prices and subsidies, and what target we want to get to. We can put all of this information in, and those parameters can then give us out what is the energy demand, how does land use look in terms of forestation and deforestation, what are emissions across different sectors, what investments are required to bring about this world, what technology has been deployed based on the assumptions we've made, what are prices for commodities, and then many, many other variables. So just as an example, the models of the network on greening the financial system have something like 1,700 different variables that come out as outputs. So you have a very rich fabric to look at in order to understand not only what goes into the model, but also the world that comes out of it. So unlike a single regression-based model or unlike a single sensitivity analysis, the goal here is not to look at how a single factor changes, but rather to look at, on our road to a particular decarbonization target, what are the steps that need to take place? And what does that development look like in terms of policies, in terms of economies, in terms of different sectors? And so one of the big benefits there is that in doing so, this kind of model, this sort of approach is able to ask a lot of really valuable questions, such as what if? And the big questions that we can ask using these types of models are questions such as, hey, I want to understand how climate can develop, and I want to understand how we get to a 2-degree world. Unlike the physical risk models that we talked about yesterday, which sort of start with a level of emissions and go to a level of warming and impacts, these models start with the question we want to ask. Questions these models are good at answering are going to be questions like, how much energy does the world need in 2050? Other questions are going to be, to get to a 2-degree world, how much do we need to cut emissions across different sectors? Other questions are, what is the cheapest and most economical way for us to drive down emissions to align to a 1.5-degree trajectory? These are the types of questions that we can parameterize. These are what we tend to call, as these types of models are known as not predictive, but rather as models that produce a given outcome. They are goal-seeking in their nature, and they allow us to ask these sophisticated and complex questions. One of the important things also to realize, though, is because of that complexity, there are a number of benefits and drawbacks to using the models. The benefits are that we can really, by talking to the modelers, assess a number of different scenarios. You want to make an assumption on the technology side about the use of carbon dioxide removal. I think your assumption is too ambitious. You and I both look at the same model, and in yours, we limit the amount of, or in mine, we limit the amount of carbon dioxide removal. In yours, we don't. And as a result, what we produce are two different outputs. One where the output is specifically without carbon dioxide removal, one where we use carbon dioxide removal. And we can see different costs, different economic trajectories based on those decisions. And so that ability to tweak and twist different parameters allows us to get a more detailed picture of the world. On the downside, there are a lot of cross dependencies and limitations. These limitations can be things such as the fact that the models really look at optimizing on cost. So even though they may be used by modelers as part of the NGFS for stress testing, they're not inherently stressful. Just because a transition is taking place doesn't mean it's the most stressful way to get there. One of the big elements of these scenarios is also that they're long-term. Because they're long-term, that means that they don't do a great job looking at the near-term and narrow levels of volatility. What I mean by that is things like, oh, how do prices shift over month to month, year to year due to shocks in demand? These models are going to smooth that out. Similarly, if we're in an economic recession, the decisions a government might make are going to be quite different. We're going to decide maybe not to cut emissions as fast, or maybe we're going to decide that we can't keep providing subsidies for renewables. These questions of political and economic feasibility are not really ones that these models can are able to really explore with as much detail. So realizing that we're going to go into the scenario narratives first, another element that I wanted to cover is specifically on what enhancements are going on with these models. So many criticisms of these models have been, they just look at a least cost way to get to the reductions. They don't care about other goals like nature, biodiversity, equality, and relationships between countries. However, those parameters can be added in and then models be rerun. So questions of political feasibility, what is a maximum rate of decarbonization that we can expect in a country? These models can begin to ask those questions, but we need to be very specific. If we don't include them, we're going to be overlooking the political dimensions, the overall short-term economic dimensions, as well as potentially realizing that it looks like a much easier path to decarbonization than it actually is, because this is kind of the best case way to get to a given temperature. The models are never going to produce additional costs above and beyond what is necessary to get there, because their goal is to try to tell you a way to get there in a cost-efficient and welfare increasing way. And the reason for that is that these models, as I mentioned, many of them are submitted to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The reason that this is so is because these were initially models designed not for financial institutions, but for policymakers. So just because they are being adopted and adapted for the NGFS and for others to use for their targets, for others to use for risk analysis, they were initially a policy-based tool. And so as a result, many of those volatilities that are so important in risk, many of these questions of feasibility are left instead to the policymaker or left instead to the risk analyst to decide. So what I'm really trying to get across here is these models are really valuable as providing perhaps the most detailed picture of the world we can create in the future, not as a prediction, but as a potential scenario. However, they do have these important limitations of being more long-term, overlooking the volatility, not necessarily considering all questions of feasibility, and sometimes without proper parameters, lacking the information that is going to make the results more realistic. So it may suggest using lots of land for bioenergy with carbon capture if we don't tell it that we need to use that land instead for food and limit that amount. So these are all kinds of things that you should be aware of as we use the scenarios, because these are in many cases the scenarios that are being adopted by the NGFS. They're similar to the types of models that the IEA produces. And so as a result, they have a lot of value in our understanding, but also can't be considered without understanding those assumptions. So before I talk about the narratives related to these scenarios, as well as some of the specific elements within the scenarios themselves, are there any questions kind of about the technical guts of these models and operation? I think there are a few questions maybe in the audience, and then obviously any questions from the Zoom, eager to take those too.
Hello, David. Well, I have two questions. The first one is regarding your last idea that sometimes these models give you different results that can not be aligned with the practical measurements of some variables. For example, I remember I read about the difference between emissions of land use in national inventories versus the emissions of land use in these integrated assessment models. Are there any examples of that kind of differences in terms of financial, in the financial world? And the second question will be, I understand that in the economic system, most of the times, or in some models, they use CG models. So, and those models are very questioned within the economic academia, no? So I wanted to understand if there are also this kind of questioning within the role of CGs in EM models, in IAM models. Sorry.
Yeah, so I'll take the first question first. Yeah, the models are highly subject to the assumptions put into them. So things such as emissions intensity and benefits from different activities. So if we assume an acre of forest is going to store 2 tons of carbon versus 5 tons, those things will have implications. They can be reparameterized in the models, but it's the underlying studies and assessments that will play a critical role in that. Similarly, questions that often become really important are ones of technological deployment. How much does the cost fall for battery storage in 2030? If I have a 5% learning by doing rate on an annual basis, with the idea that every year the costs are falling on a compounded 5% basis, and you have a 7% assumption, the relative cost as well as the relative desirability of deployment is also going to differ. And so a lot of times people don't open up the box on these models, but when it comes to a specific parameter, the nice thing is that they are really largely open source. So it becomes really critical for us to ask those questions. And I think a lot of people get intimidated by, these are big models. As I said, many of the NGFS models have hundreds, if not over 1,000 variables in each of them. But the idea is, if you're going to be using a variable, understanding the assumptions behind it, the nice thing is these are not vended approaches. So even if you're working with a vendor, their underlying approach will be, oh, we're using the Remind model from the NGFS, or we're using the IEA. There should be transparency on what goes into those assumptions. And I think it's the responsibility of those in the risk management space to understand what those assumptions are in order to ensure that the model is appropriately parameterized. And also, as I said, to know what the models do well and do poorly. If you're going to try to use the model to say, what is the overall change in losses between now and 2025, you're only going to get a relatively limited effect because there are only going to be 2 data points. These are models with multi-year time steps. So you can interpolate, but fundamentally you're going to have on an annualized basis. Whereas if you're looking, say, at equity prices or unemployment or economic growth, you may want quarterly data. You may want more frequent data in order to not miss a total boom and bust. What looks like a flat performance of the economy could be actually masking a significant decline followed by a significant rebound. And so if you're looking to do short-term stress analysis, these models are not going to be as effective for that. If you're going to look at long-term management decisions about what does a sector decarbonization look like and what risks are posed through that decarbonization, then the models will be better suited. Now, on the CGE models about general equilibrium models and their use, so NIGEM is a general equilibrium model. As you might suggest, the NIGEM part is National Institute and GEM is generalized equilibrium model. And yeah, I think the point is there are a number of economic schools of thought on what the appropriateness of different modeling techniques is. And I think that's why it's important to not be a passive observer to these and take the outputs as the truth, but rather take them as a data point. And what we see a lot, I think the most successful and most advanced companies using these models are ones that use them as the general frame to say, this is a science-based pathway to decarbonization. But if I really want to understand economic impacts, I'm going to look at whether the short-term shocks that are provided by a model like NIGEM line up with my expectations. So if they say that by a decrease in demand, we see these kind of changes in prices, does that actually align with our economic intuition? And so this is a role where we can, if we look at specific slices of the model, bring in our experts. I think a lot of people think this is a whole new field. We don't understand the climate models. They're so big and complicated. But within each component of them are elements that your organization should have experts well equipped to cover. So the macroeconomic components, those in the economics departments can see, does this pass the smell test? If we saw a carbon price of $100, these are still questions that people are considering, outside of the climate modeling community. Likewise, for your energy industry analyst, do they believe that coal is going to be 80% reduced by 2030? Yes or no? Those are the kinds of things that by breaking the model into its components, we can then start to question and challenge the assumptions. The elegance of the model is that it gives us a big global picture. And it's actually once we start drilling down that we may see that we need to make some adjustments to the specific elements while still understanding the broader pathway that they follow. So I think on the CGE component, that's one of the elements in which generalized equilibrium is, one approach to consider. It's the approach NIGEM considers. If I recall correctly, for G cubed is a little bit different. GTAP is another model that's kind of like NIGEM, but the G cubed model, I forget how it does its sector-based approach. I'll have to come back to that, but its approach is a little bit different. So there are, different economic parameterizations. And this, I think, gets into an area of relative expertise for many firms. Yeah.
One more question. Well, I was going to ask you about the use of the decarbonization sector pathways. If you use it for a company, you are in some way supposing that all countries are going to have the same regulation and they are going to follow more or less at the same time. That's my first question. And the second question is regarding the use of, how do you say? I'm going to say it in Spanish.
Sure. Yeah, no problem.
O sea, ¿cómo le hacemos para utilizar?
How or what indicators can we have? So, for example, if you go to the field and you're going to do an in-field assessment in the agricultural sector, if they are already, well, if they are already getting ready for climate change, adaptation. Let's say that they're already working on adaptation. How much is the risk decreasing by adaptation?
No, I got it. It's such a good question. It's a little more on the physical risk side, but I'll cover it because I think it'll be of interest to the wider group as well. Let me take the first question first, just continuing on our theme of what these scenarios do and don't do. Most of the models, actually, I would say all of the commonly used ones have regional breakouts. They have submodels. The IEA has submodels. Remind, Message, GCAM, they all have submodels at a regional level of resolution to say, this is what the region's pathway is, because we know that, between China and Canada, we're not going to see the same, or between Malawi and Mexico, between, the United States and Micronesia, we're not going to see the same routes pursued. And so that differentiation does occur at a regional level. The NGFS tried a couple years ago and continues to do national level downscaling. A word of caution on that, I think a lot of it isn't really focused on the economic realities on the ground and is more a sort of pro rata effort. So, okay, Mexico is 20% of the Latin American economy. So if I don't have a Mexico model, but I have a Latin American model as an example, I could ascribe 20% of energy demand to Mexico. That might be true, that might not be true. And it might be the reality that, oh, actually Mexico's production is a lot more fossil fuel heavy relative to Brazil's. And as a result, that's not a great assumption to make because it should have a disproportionate share. So these kind of elements of national differences, it's, one of my sort of big pet causes and something that we want to work on as the UN in 2023 with these modelers, which is getting national pathways really developed, working with modelers within countries to develop this. But just to say there is regional breakouts. In some cases, there's even country level breakouts. What I've found a little bit frustrating, and I would argue potentially inappropriate, is many companies, when they've set their net zero targets, they've used global pathways. I would say almost the vast majority of them have. And it doesn't take much effort to understand why this doesn't make sense. So if you're a US company and you're looking at aviation, and aviation perhaps doesn't see a decrease in emissions because demand grows so much until 2030 and then begins to reduce, US companies can't possibly, American Airlines, United, Delta, they can't possibly be following that same course because that's not going to leave any room for airlines in Africa with massive demand, increase in Latin America in demand, increase in India. And so there is something that is a little bit ridiculous about setting a target on a global pathway. We're unfortunately in this session focused more on risk, so we're not going to necessarily cover as much of that. But what I would say is in the risk modeling work, typically it is the variables that are used at a regional level or even that are further downscaled either by the NGFS or by the individual company using the analysis that makes it more applicable. And then the next question, which I really like, but ties a little more to yesterday's discussion of physical risk, is a term, I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with this term of adaptive capacity, which is to say, how much can a firm offset the effects of physical risk due to adaptation and adaptive actions? And on a national scale, how much can a national economy offset the negative impacts of climate change due to adaptation? And the answer to this is a little bit unclear because as climate effects mount, it becomes more and more uncertain what is really adaptable versus not. If your entire home is flooded, if you are an island nation, at what point does that become unadaptable? You can't clearly live underwater. However, if you are living on a coast, the difference between the damage with and without a seawall is a pretty important consideration. So I think more and more providers of risk analysis are trying to consider adaptive capacity. There's some interesting economic studies that are more macro scale about what levels of climate are adaptable, how much we can offset these, because the truth is that climate has a lot of indicators going in different directions. For example, in colder climates, we're going to see longer growing seasons, we're going to see more greening. So we may see agricultural output increase in Canada at the same time it decreases in Mexico. We could also see benefits that energy demand falls in Russia because it's warmer. And so most of the cost that was going toward heating is actually reduced. Whereas at the same time in India, due to higher temperatures, we see an increase in costs. So there are different directional indicators, and it's not always so easy to disentangle them. But at the same time, we also know that we're not standing still. So as countries become wealthier, we know that their adaptive capacity increases. And this has been an argument made by many of the developing world nations at the COP climate discussions, which is, well, our incentive should be to develop as fast as possible because the best climate resilience plan on a national level is to be ready for climate change. And so if that means increasing our emissions, kind of getting back to the question asked earlier, then so be it, but that's what we want to do. And for developed countries to say, we don't really have the airspace to do that. We can't stick to our climate goals and still do that. So in that case, what kind of organized international mechanisms exist to allow that transfer to take place, to allow incentives to avoid carbon solutions that are adaptive and instead choose other types of solutions? Because we know, while there's a lot of mathematics in understanding how high sea levels will rise, understanding where to build the seawall, many of the most important adaptive capacity elements for a single asset or for a country are going to be well known: reliable energy, reliable transportation, strong provision of local services, resilient supply chains. These kind of things are quite knowable. And so the question is, a lot of them track relatively closely to economic development and national wealth. And so what I would suggest looking at, if you're interested in that space, is some of the studies that have been done on adaptive capacity at different temperatures, as well as the relationship between national income and climate adaptation. Question?
Thank you. How can we account for uncertainty around these models? Because when I look to a particular pathway, I'm not sure if I am looking at deterministic at the output of a deterministic model, or if I am looking at the mean of an stochastic model. So we use these pathways, we use these scenarios, but we only use either the mean or either deterministic model. So my question is, how can we account for the uncertainty around these models? Because I mean, how sure are we that if we take certain or a particular action to mitigate climate change, how sure we are that that will lead to that specific pathway? But there are, of course, possible, events or possible deviations. So how can we account for uncertainty? Thank you.
Yeah, so I would say on the transition side, there's uncertainty in terms of, say, growth rates, development of technologies, deployment, costs, investment required. You might say that Mexico needs $400 billion on an annualized basis to reach its net zero transition. I might say 200 billion. A modeler might look at a study and pick a mean estimate between those. But those are kinds of areas where we see relative ranges, and it's more about the transparency. When it comes to impacts from specific actions, This is actually something that the IPCC does study and does try to bring a good amount of detail to. And one of the areas where it does this is at the very beginning of the overall report, it explains the meaning of different likelihoods, of different impacts, because each of them are probabilistic in nature. So to say something is very likely in IPCC speak means something precise in the sense of a 95% confidence, or highly likely a 90% confidence. And so that idea there is there are uncertainties, there's certainly tail risks and extreme events, but one of the things kind of as I was showing yesterday with those climate impacts are at certain points that likelihood becomes, you know, less of a tail risk and more of a mean risk. In terms of adaptation and in terms of mitigation, measures that are seen to be effective in reducing emissions, the IPCC has kind of categorized not only which are most effective in their opinion, but which kind of have the biggest impact. Again, these are still probabilistic, and in these models, one of the important questions is understanding the underlying engine. So what model are you using to assume climate? Because if you and I both have different views of how quickly the climate will change, your model might run behind mine in terms of you think you're able to adapt and to transition, whereas in my model, you needed to do that 5 years ago. And so understanding, and in some ways, it's a little bit of a lame answer to this, but many of these models, because they're already so big and clunky, try to simplify that down a lot. And so we'll talk about that on the ensuing pages about the specific instance of the NGFS models. But what they try to do is say, like, I don't know how many people will be in the world in 2050 and 2100, but maybe we can kind of leave that aside by all of us in all of our scenarios making the same assumption, which is a median growth estimate of global population or demography. Maybe on economic growth, you see a much wealthier world than I do. And if we use growth as not an endogenous factor, but an exogenous one that comes from somewhere else, let's use the kind of average of current trends. Let's use the average. And so they try to control for some of that uncertainty. Same thing with the carbon budget. They say, okay, what is the average estimate of carbon remaining? There are some modelers that say, we've already surpassed our 1.5 degree budget. I don't know why you guys keep talking about that we have 7 years, because under my model, we've already set in place systems that are going to warm the planet by more than 1.5 degrees. Others say, actually, you have a bit more leeway than the average model suggests, because our model shows that climate is offset in some ways by other features. The models realize that like this can become head-spinningly complex. You can just keep thinking about these things. And so most of the models used by the IEA and by the NGFS really try to take those big assumptions and kind of hold them steady as this is what the middle of the IPCC distribution says about how quick the planet warms, about what the potential emissions associated with a given activity are. They try to keep those consistent so you can play with the parameters maybe that are less technical and more potentially interesting to an investigator, a policymaker, or a risk manager, such as, oh, we're looking at a 2 degree world, we're looking at a 1.5 degree world. I have no faith in the creation of removal technologies at scale, so let's scale those down, let's scale them up. Those kind of things are more the dials that they want to be able to turn. But what I think people often overlook is in using middle of the road assumptions, you're still making assumptions. And so that uncertainty still exists despite the fact that they try to kind of quiet it down. And the best example of that, and you heard Francisco talk about this yesterday, and then Matthias about the shared socioeconomic pathways. There's one pathway called SSP2, which is the middle between the other 4 pathways. And it's no surprise that the NGFS modelers use that as their main pathway, because that way it takes out some of the assumptions of, oh, really fast fossil development, or, oh, really fast green development. It kind of says, we're going to hedge our bets on that, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how different sectors change, given that we're following the middle of the road. So a lot of questions related to that, similar to what you had asked as well. But I think it's important to recognize that these are important tools for sort of seeing what a world could look like, but you may want to individually challenge particular assumptions, both in terms of how risky you see certain activities are, as well as how beneficial you might see them to be.
¿Qué tal? Buenos días. Talking about business cycles, are the scenarios based on a critical change in the economic trends? I mean, a secular modification in the potential growth? And related to this, are those scenarios considering the different depth and lengths for the midterm? And I asking that because, as you mentioned earlier today, it is critical, the elasticity across assets and the sensitivity against the business cycle.
Yeah, so these models don't do as much focus on the business cycle, which is why it's necessary to complement their outputs with the work of macroeconomic modelers, because they tend to look on multi-year time steps that probably either miss a business cycle, and as a result, they tend to make growth assumptions. Often the growth assumptions come from the International Monetary Fund and look at their middle of the road growth assumption. And that's kind of growth continuing on trends, or a relationship, if it's a little more sophisticated, between growth and wealth, that as nations become wealthier, growth begins to slow and level off. But those are the kinds of approaches that typically are taken within models, which means that, and that's really why the NGFS, in developing some of its new tools over the last 2 years, 2021 and 2022, has incorporated macro models to give a better sense of what this actually might mean. Great, you can say we're starting a transition tomorrow and we're increasing carbon price to $200 per ton, or whatever the price you want to come up with is, but that's going to have economic consequences. These models are a little bit less interested in that and a little more interested in the overall equilibrium, and that's why they are part of the answer. That's why they are part of a global perspective, but they aren't going to give you the full perspective on, how a business cycle shifts. And that's just, a little bit of the nature of them. But maybe one thing we can do now is we have a bit of an exercise coming up in about 15 or 20 minutes. And to set up that exercise, I want to talk about the specific instance of the NGFS scenarios, because these are the ones that are probably most commonly used by regulators. We can leave this up for now. So we'll go through these remaining pages, and then we'll switch to the poll. So using this as the specific example, these are probably the most commonly used for climate disclosures and climate risk analysis, but they're also the most commonly used by regulators in their stress testing analyses. And the NGFS scenarios begin with 4 different narratives, and they build models for 3 of these narratives. The 4 narratives reflect trade-offs between physical and transition risks, and they reflect trade-offs not in the climate system. As I said, part of the goal of this modeling effort is to look at the mitigation side. So they've tried to quiet these questions of uncertainty in terms of the rate of development of various warming, various negative impacts from climate change. They say, okay, assuming that's going to happen at the average rate from the IPCC, what human choices can we make? And so those choices can be, we can choose to meet our climate goals, and we can then choose to meet those goals in an effective manner or an ineffective manner. If we meet those goals effectively, what we've done is we've limited warming, so we've reduced our physical risks, and we've helped to reduce some of our transition risks by proceeding in a globally sensible method. However, we can also reach our climate goals through emergency actions that might be the result of immediate policies, that might be the result of the collapse of certain economic sectors, that might be really not desirable for overall economies, but might be a more likely outcome for reaching those climate goals. And in those cases, we see what's called a disorderly transition. Lower physical risks because we limit temperature rise, but higher transition risks as governments don't take roles to coordinate with industries. Governments don't take roles to limit the economic fallout of the transition. And then on the other side of the page, we see various scenarios where physical risks mount. And in one, we see a gradual strengthening of climate policies called the nationally determined contributions. In other cases, we don't take further climate action. This leads us to what's called a hothouse world. This is where we don't do enough to actually stop climate change. And as the scenario goes on, physical risks get worse and worse and worse. but the transition risks are relatively mild. The one scenario that the NGFS doesn't actually really cover in this 2x2 narrative is this scenario called the too little too late, which really involves attempts to limit warming, but unsuccessful attempts. And that creates transition risk and it creates physical risk, but it doesn't solve either of them fully. And so they don't consider that one just because in doing a stress test, in doing a risk analysis, they want to look at the stylized approach. How do we get to our global climate goals? Or what happens if we don't take the necessary actions to get there? Or what happens if there's a lot of transition risk that isn't well managed? Those are the kinds of exam questions that the NGFS is most interested in. And that's why they've focused on those three boxes of orderly, disorderly, and hothouse world. And what do those look like in practice? Well, those look like a series of 6 sub-narratives that we're going to talk about in more detail. Those sub-narratives are 2 for each of them. For orderly, there is a net zero by 2050 scenario. This is also similar in its approach to the IEA scenario, if you've heard of their net zero by 2050 scenario. This is one where the world, in the most efficient way it can, gets to net zero by 2050, limits global warming to below 1.5 degrees, and manages many of the physical risks. The second one is slightly less ambitious. It's called below 2 degrees. It's technically consistent with the Paris Agreement, but is less ambitious because it seeks not to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, but to limit it to 2 degrees. It's going to see slightly worse physical impacts, but also lower transition risks. The disorderly transition, they look at 2 different scenarios. One called divergent net zero, where countries pursue different pathways to net zero, creating conflicts such as trade wars, creating supply chain issues as certain countries take action, others resist action, but ultimately they do reach net zero. And then finally, in the disorderly transition scenario, there's also a delayed action scenario where we continue doing what we're doing until we realize around 2030 that we really do need to take action. At that point, the cuts that are required are so severe, the carbon prices needed are so high that disruption is unavoidable in terms of its negative economic consequences. Then in the hothouse world scenario, these are more designed to investigate physical risks, less designed to investigate expanding transition risks. There are the assumptions that firms follow their nationally determined contributions. So everything they've said that they will do, they actually go through and follow. However, that's still not enough to get us to net zero, and so warming continues above 2 degrees. We also have a scenario where we don't do what we say that we're going to do and only do what we're currently doing. This is called the current policy scenario. It's the least ambitious scenario, and it's the one with the highest physical risks. And you can see that there are 2 important moderators of these scenarios. The first is emissions, so how quickly they go down, as well as carbon price development. And so you can see across the different scenarios that get to net zero see rapid fall in emissions. Scenarios below 2 degrees also see rapid fall. When we wait to reduce emissions, that fall takes place later, but more steeply. And I like to think of steepness on an emissions graph as an evidence of transition pressure, because if somebody says you have to cut emissions 10% next year, that's going to be a lot harder than saying you have to cut 10% in 5 years. And so the faster you see that fall, the steeper you see those lines in terms of emissions, think higher transition risk. Now, likewise, you can see if we follow our nationally determined contributions, we begin to drive emissions down. If all we do is what we're doing today, we don't bring emissions down at all. Now, the reverse is true when we think about carbon price. The carbon price in these models is not just a price used by governments, but a compendium of all the different types of methods, approaches, and tools that governments and policymakers have in order to affect the transition. So the idea of this is that a subsidy can be converted into a carbon price. If I pay you a certain amount of money per megawatt of energy generated using renewables, that functionally can be then equated to a given carbon price, with the idea in the economic consideration that that carbon price has an associated cost on the economy. This also has a cost, and both of them are particular tools. So just to simplify these things down, when the climate modelers think about all of those policy decisions, they put them into what they call a shadow carbon price. Sorry, what curves? So yeah, so they do. So marginal abatement is going to be you know, a sectoral consideration. They do consider that in terms of building what they believe the carbon price to be. But in doing so, it's not a true carbon price. So I wouldn't say, oh, Mexico has a carbon price of X. What I would say is the effective carbon price would be such. And that's just how they work. But the idea is, if I said steepness of the line and the depth of the line relates to transition pressure on emissions, in carbon price development, it works as a bit of a mirror image. The steeper the rise and the higher the rise, the more economic pressure. Because think about a carbon price, like it or not, is a form of a tax. It can be a tax to improve efficiency by reducing externalities, but still a tax. And so if you're a company that is a high emitter, the higher that carbon price is, the more disruptive that is to your business operations. And secondly, the more rapidly that carbon price rises, the less time you have to adapt your business model. Let's say you have high inventory or you have high capital cost, suddenly demand is slashed by a rapid spike. That's going to be harder to adjust to than a slow phase in. So whenever people are looking at these scenarios and trying to understand what level of transition risk they see, I often ask them to think about what is the emissions pathway, what is the carbon price development, as probably the two most important factors that you'll see. Now, to talk a little bit about those risks in a bit more detail, physical risk is kind of straightforward with the idea that physical risk tracks temperature. And this is actually shown by whenever you work with a physical risk model or physical risk data, that model is calibrated off a particular temperature trajectory. And then, so the modelers doing flood risk are saying, as warming increases, this is our belief in the relationship between that and the level of floods. This is our belief between temperature and heat waves. Those relationships may be complicated, but fundamentally, they are a positive correlation. There are no climate impacts that are less so at a higher temperature than at a lower temperature. There's certainly natural phenomenon. Clearly, there's less ice at a higher temperature than a lower temperature. But typically, the idea that climate risk on the physical side tracks temperature is pretty clear and intuitive. The transition is interesting because these different scenarios have different narratives. In the net zero scenarios, the policy action is smooth. In the delayed transition scenario, policy action creates a higher risk. Why? Because it has to be more stringent, it has to be more severe. And in the delayed transition, it also creates a significant risk. Why does it create that risk? Because countries are following different policies that can leave them in conflict with each other economically. On the technology side, this is an assumption that the models make, that changes are going to happen faster in certain sectors, and the faster those changes are, the more disruption there is. So if you think about this as how soon will a technology be cost competitive with an incumbent, you might have the generalized assumption that the shorter duration that incumbent has of being able to own the market, the more pressure that incumbent is going to face in the near term. And so technology development, better technologies, cheaper technologies, the assumptions around them relate directly to transition risk. And so the idea is that more policy pressure is going to accelerate technology development, which is going to lead to technology risk. On the carbon dioxide removal, this is another element that I mentioned, which is the more removals used, the more of an assumption we're making. Because if we have to take out of the atmosphere, we need to pay for those costs, and we need to assume that development takes place to make this cost effective. And so in a riskier scenario, we're going to have to pay more, we're going to have to develop these technologies in order to get us there. So ones that are more reliant on those technologies are going to be costlier, are going to be more risky. And then finally, from a regional policy variation, as I said, global economic cooperation in these efforts is important because supply chains themselves are so globalized. If we see conflicts between nations that have climate policies and those that don't, we're going to see economic losses at the border in terms of border adjustments. We're going to see supply chain disruptions. So companies and conglomerates that are putting together products are going to see variable pricing for the different inputs that go into those products. And so as a result, one can make the intuition, not only is the strength of the policy important, but also the coordination across borders with those policies. So those are some of the narratives that I think are really essential. And now I wanted to do kind of a quick walkthrough of a few really interesting variables that are produced by the scenarios to just give you a flavor of what they are and why they matter. And then after that, we'll switch to doing our exercise and talk through some of the specifics of that exercise. So as I said before, I'm not going to spend too much time on this one, but saying one of the key variables is carbon price. It's probably the first one I look at when I'm trying to assess a transition risk. And as you can see, the net zero scenarios, these two here in the tan and brown, lead to higher carbon prices than the current policy and the NDC scenarios down here. And as I said, carbon price is a good proxy for the level of transition pressure, because what they are literally doing is all of those policies that go into the carbon price are making it no longer economic to continue emitting and making the transition occur at a faster rate. So higher carbon price, higher risk. The next consideration is about energy composition and energy use. Different scenarios make different assumptions on this. I've tried to bracket, although not very neatly, the NGFS scenarios in here. But what you can see is there are two big changes that go on between the start of a scenario and the end of a scenario. The first is energy demand. Most people would assume that as the world gets wealthier, as development occurs, energy demand increases. And that is true as long as energy efficiency also isn't improved. The reason energy efficiency is important is because it can help curtail energy demand, meaning that we don't need to do as much build out of renewables. That means that we don't need to do as much build out of fossil fuels in the near term. So energy efficiency is important because if you're looking at an energy company, how much it's able to sell in the future is going to be a direct relationship between energy demand now as well as energy demand in the future. If we need less energy from a given source, then there's going to be a contraction in the addressable market that that sector faces. Also, composition changes. So if we move from high renewable or high fossil fuels to high renewables, those changes are also going to reflect transition pressure. Let's say we're looking at a coal producer. Coal here is in the gray. Let's use GCAM as an example. By the end of the scenario, GCAM has no coal at all. So it's not only that the overall energy market has changed in size, but it's actually, in fact, that the overall element of coal has totally gone away. So if you're working with a coal company that hasn't transitioned to a different sector of the economy, that model that you're using is going to see no economic role for that. Again, another area is how much expansion. So on the climate opportunity side, let's look at something else. Let's look at renewables. Renewables here in the Remind model only make up about 20%. This is including solar, it's including wind, it's also including geothermal and hydropower, even though hydropower is controversially considered renewable. It's not fully renewable. But you can look now at Remind at the end. This now makes up over 60% of the energy balance. And the importance there is saying, how big is that growth? Is it a 200% growth? Is it 500%? All of those are going to be considerations that are really going to make a difference in terms of the scale and scope of the overall transition. Another example is this idea, and somebody asked about this yesterday, peak emissions and temperature overshoot. All else equal, peak emissions are going to be ones that are how high the temperature gets, when it gets that high, and how much we exceed. And all else equal, scenarios with a lot of overshoot are going to have lower transition risk because they're going to allow us to put more emissions into the atmosphere in the near term, but are going to make the assumption in the long term that we're going to have to take them out. So if you peak emissions earlier, you're going to need to have more of a transition than if you peak them later. On the other hand, if you peak them later, the transition will have to be steeper to get to decarbonization. And so the year of the peak, as well as how much overshoot we see, as I said yesterday, overshoot is essentially borrowing from the future. So we don't need to reduce emissions as quickly if we're going to allow ourselves to overshoot and then come back to our temperature. And so as a result, one of the criticisms of these scenarios is that they incentivize the use of removal technologies. They allow physical risks to mount because of the assumption we can just do it later. And so while there is definitely a transition benefit, you don't have to move as quickly on the transition, there is a downside to the overshoot scenarios. So when somebody says they have a very strict scenario that is no overshoot at all, what you should be thinking is that's going to be a really tough scenario for a high emitter to produce, because a high emitter is not going to have any extra leeway. They're going to need to get their emissions down quickly, and they're going to need to get to net zero faster than they would if they could take out emissions later on in the scenario. Another importance that relates directly to that is how much negative emissions we can assume. The more negative emissions we can assume, the easier the transition becomes, because what we're doing, again, is borrowing from the future. We're saying we don't need to reduce oil use today because we'll just take those emissions that we emit today in 2022 out at some later date. This, as I said, justifiably is very controversial because it allows not only an incentive to continue emitting actions, but also it allows physical risks to mount. So it's not really necessarily a desirable thing, but if you're comparing two scenarios to each other and trying to understand which one is more of a transition risk, the one that will have lower use of removal technologies, negative emissions, is going to be more severe because you're going to have less of that cushion later on in order to reduce that those emissions. And so that's kind of what I was talking about being conservative when I said the One Earth climate model is very conservative, that it didn't really allow for negative emissions. This is what I meant, that it is going to mean it is a harder transition to make because of the fact that you don't have that ability to make it up later. This is just a brief slide. There's a lot on it, but just to say different models have different technological assumptions. Some assume electric vehicles, but only for light transportation. Others assume electric vehicles in heavier freight and shipping. Some assume technologies such as small modular nuclear. Others don't assume any advancement in the nuclear industry. These are all assumptions that different modelers will make depending on their own opinions of how those technologies develop and the studies they're using. And similarly, the more technologically optimistic you are, the easier the transition will be for the society, the more technology risk there will be for incumbents, because they will likely be facing competitors from these low carbon industries themselves. Finally, the last thing I would mention, as I said, is different pathways matter in terms of socioeconomics. All else equal, a transition will be harder for a bigger population in the world because there will be more people requiring more energy relative to a smaller population. That doesn't mean that population is the problem. It just means if you have two scenarios, one scenario is 8 billion people, one scenario is 10 billion, the level of what you need to transition is going to be higher in the 10 billion scenario because you need to provide zero carbon energy for 10 billion instead of 8 billion people. Similarly, economic growth is similar. There is a positive correlation between energy demand and economic growth. There's a positive correlation also between emissions and economic growth. And what that means is wealthier societies are going to be better able to deal with climate change. Wealthier societies are going to be able to better fulfill their development goals, but they also importantly are going to have a longer road to reach their transition because of the fact that if everyone is living in an industrialized society, the level of energy demanded is going to need to be provided from more renewable plants. Imagine everyone is using the same amount of energy and then that doubles. Where does that other energy come from? It's going to require more investment. It's going to require more incentives to create renewables. So all else equal, a bigger population, a wealthier population makes the transition a tougher one overall. It's not that that's a bad thing, but it's when you're comparing two scenarios, a scenario where growth is more rapid is likely also going to be a scenario where you're trying to fight harder against fossil fuel development as well. And so just to keep those in mind, again, this is not making a value of it's good to have negative emissions. It's good to have a high carbon price. It's good to have energy like this or that. We're not really making any assessments of that. What we're trying to do is make assessments of what we believe a credible future might look like, and whether you agree or disagree with those scenarios can help inform how you adapt your assumptions in doing the risk analysis that you'll do. So what I'm going to do now is go to our exercise. And the reason I will skip questions is the first question of the exercise is actually, are there other questions about scenarios? So what we can do is switch to the Menti poll, and I'll show you the link for menti.com. Okay, great. There we go. Very good. Okay. So, so for those of you who can now see the screen again, just to say that you will go to menti.com. Sometimes this is blocked by certain computer security. So what I recommend is just going to menti.com on your device. There's no specific information identifying you, so it's totally anonymized. But if you type in those numbers, then you'll be brought to the link, and then we can see as the results come in what questions you have, and then when we'll proceed with the rest of the exercise, we'll get your opinions of a number of things. So I'll wait a minute or two just to let everyone get there, both those on the Zoom link as well as those in the room. And then, as I said, you'll be able to submit any questions anonymously. So I'll just give a minute more for questions, but maybe if you can put your hands up if you've been able to get to the Menti page, that would be super, just so we get a sense of who is still working on it. So if you're on the Menti, you don't have to ask a question, but as we go through the exercise, you may want to participate. So what will happen is as I change my clicker, you'll see a new screen on whatever device you're using, and then you can use that to fill out your responses. So just let me know if you are able to go. I'll begin answering the questions while giving time for others to ask some questions. So why is it hard to model SSP4 for the 1.9 degree, or sorry, 1.9 RCP? What are the most probable regulatory changes? And then how much dependence does this have on the past? Remember, these are mostly focused on transition scenarios. So I'll start with this first one. Why is it hard for shared socioeconomic pathway 4? So shared socioeconomic pathway 4 is one of mounting inequality. It's one where the industrialized world becomes wealthier, where the nations that are developing don't develop as quickly. The reason that most ambitious representative concentration pathway, or RCP, is more challenging under that is because global cooperation is really essential in actually reaching that mitigation outcome, because it really depends on incentives from the industrialized world to avoid carbon lock-in in the developing world. It's also necessary for global accountability mechanisms to take place and create the economic incentives such as global carbon prices. And that's why the models tend to find it challenging for that really strong mitigation outcome to take place when there's regional inequality that is mounting. As far as most probable regulatory changes in Mexico, what I would say is I would expect more climate disclosure requirements in keeping with that emergence of standards from the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board. I would think that within the financial sector, it's likely that a scenario analysis exercise or stress test will be developed by the central bank over the next couple of years. So as far as regulatory changes, as I said, climate disclosure requirements, a scenario analysis exercise, I think are probably the most likely. What dependence do these scenarios have on the past? I would say that these scenarios are entirely dependent on the past in terms of the information that comes in terms of things such as what the overall levels of fossil fuel use are, what the emergence of technological advancement are. They make new assumptions based on that, but there's a big reason that we've seen the level of temperature in the scenarios decrease in current policies from 4 degrees to now closer to 3 degrees. And that's because the scenarios use what information is available to them at present. And so it's not that one scenario is more right or more wrong, it's that these are dependent on where we are. So as we get more information about the climate system, we may find that we need to reduce emissions even faster. As we find more information about the rate of transition. And so all of these are past values that then we're looking at how would those trends change in the future. Company scenarios, I think, should be considered on an annual basis while you're doing annual reporting. It's unlikely you're going to need to change scenarios every year, but there may be material updates, and especially if those are relevant for a sector you operate in. For example, you have high energy exposure and energy prices, say for natural gas, are 5 times higher now than they are a year ago. That might be a cause to consider using a different short-term scenario. As far as updating scenarios for your plans to decarbonize, that the alliances that work on decarbonization recommend at maximum every 5 years, but it can be more frequent, but typically 5 years for updating climate targets. Within barriers within regulation, I think it's the trade-off constantly that exists between development and environment, in the sense that many activities that have already been developed and built in are ones that continue to emit. How do we scale those down and scale up new activities in the least disruptive way possible? And I think that's one of the challenges that governments around the world face. Another area is, what is the best model for Latin America? I don't think that there's a best model per se. I would say that the GCAM model has a lot of granular data. I would also say that there are regional profiles that have been developed as well by the International Energy Agency that may be of interest. And then if we create our own scenario, how reliable can that be? I would say that the question of reliability is less about predicting the future and more about predicting something that is relevant for your business. So I don't think you can create a scenario out of thin air to say, this is how we think everything will be, but to say, these are the considerations that are most relevant for us. So we're adapting the pace of the transition because we know here in Mexico, the transition is going to happen more like this rather than like that. Those things I think are very appropriate, and your local knowledge and insights are going to be particularly valuable in making those changes happen. Where to get data for the scenarios? Happily, all of the scenarios that I've talked about today are open source data. So the NGFS, if you go to their website, they have a scenario explorer. That is where free data can be downloaded. The IEA now has made their scenario data public, so you can download their scenario from the IEA.org website. Those are 2 really good sources of publicly available data on this. So at the end, will transition scenarios be comparable between different enterprises? That's really the goal. That's why the NGFS created these scenarios, was to build comparability between different scenarios, between different models, and different approaches. So the goal was to say, while there are going to be differences, if we're speaking the same language, we should be able to have a common approach. How often are transition scenarios updated? The NGFS and IEA aim to update annually, but that doesn't mean every assumption in the scenario is updated annually. You may still use the same assumption around the electric vehicle development because maybe there isn't a new data source for that. So don't be fooled by the fact that just because it's a new scenario, not everything will always be different. What you'll find is maybe it's only energy prices or cost of solar that's really been updated, but they do issue on an annual basis, at least at present. How do we consider and measure correlations between different risks? So I think this is, a question I'll let the Oliver Wyman team explore on the risk side itself. But what I would say is, as I mentioned, there's strong interplay between and interaction between the different scenarios and the different subsectors within. So as I said, there are strong correlations. If you're going to reduce energy demand in the transportation sector, that's going to have impacts on how much energy is going to be produced within the energy sector. So because of the interlinkages, there are going to be relationships and correlations. Quantifying them and what they mean for financial risk, that's going to be something I think that the conversation with Oliver Wyman will be very helpful in pointing out. Other questions I see here, models for each sector. I think what you often see are a universal model and then sector-specific sub-approaches within each. So somebody, for example, to set a net zero target could use the IEA to set that net zero target, But in doing so, what they could do is in setting a net zero target with the IEA, not use the general IEA's overall reduction, but use their estimates for transportation. So many cases, sector models are built from an overall model. That way they are ensured to be comprehensive. So we're not double counting potential energy use, potential emissions reductions, but often it is the subsector approach within a general model that gets used. How to make the scenarios consistent with price and risk of assets? Well, that's I think why the economic scenarios are a useful complement to these long-term scenarios, because they are going to be more reflective of economic conditions, asset prices, and the reality of the short-term risks. Again, a good question to ask the Oliver Wyman team, and then other questions that I see. I think that is, oh, here's one. How can it be, how can this be introduced in the in insurance risk management, considering regulator restrictions? So given that these are publicly available scenarios, I think one of the things that we can say is that by and large, just because there are industry constraints, you should have the data you need to assess the level of risk. Just because you might not be able to sell off the holdings doesn't mean you can't be prepared for them. In the same way that if I make a loan, I'm still going to be on the hook for its default, but I can hold money in reserve so that I don't go bankrupt if that default potentially occurs. So we can still have strategic and managerial actions that take place, even if we don't have full control over the assets we hold. Two last questions I'll take before we go into the exercise itself, because I want to have about 15 or 20 minutes for us to do that together. How do we know what IAMs to use depending on transition risks? So the question that I would really ask is what policies are considered within each of the models? And this is going to differ depending on the models themselves. Most of the main models from the NGFS as well as the IEA do consider traditional policy measures. So carbon prices, either cap and trade or taxes, removal of fossil fuel subsidies, incentives for renewables, investment on the part of government. The question is how much and how aggressively. That's going to be something that the scenario documentation will talk about. And then finally, considering that regulations have had a delay, how will applying regulation, what exactly will happen with that? And the answer to that I would give is that the longer we wait to make regulatory actions, the more painful those actions are going to need to be to bring us back to that path. The further that deviation gets, the more that turn is going to need to be made, and the more that challenge is going to be for companies in the regulated sectors to make those changes. So now, as I said, let's go to the next question in the Menti poll. And I showed you 6 scenario storylines in 3 different categories. So here you have the opportunity to look at the orderly transition, below 2C, net zero by 2050, disorderly with delayed action. So we'll give people a moment. And I think what'll be really interesting is to see how you vote, and also to get a perspective of, do your opinions here in this region and within your industries differ from those in other sectors that we've worked with and in other regions. So one of the outputs of this work will be sharing these results with you. So one of the reasons to participate is not only to see what your peers have to say, but also to have your own say. So I'll give a moment or two as the answers begin to come in. So it's interesting to see a lot of people think that the delayed action will actually do the job of mostly mitigating climate change. That's interesting. Like I would probably, I think that that's definitely possible. I don't know whether that's what I would say is most likely. I'm surprised nobody has said the below 2C, which is less ambitious. not that there's any right answer here. Obviously, if we knew the answer, then we could invest accordingly and be retired pretty quickly. So we don't know the answer for sure, but it's interesting to see the disorderly transition means that I think a lot of the attention today that you'll get during the next presentations should be of real interest to you. Any other respondents, giving just a moment before we go to the next question? Now maybe we'll cover a couple questions on scenario variables. Which scenario variables are you interested in? What do you want to look at? So I'll move on to that one now as well. And in this one, what we're looking at are what scenario variables you think are most important. So I've tried to give an example here. You can rate each of them, and you can rate them from 1 to 5 in terms of your risk analysis. Not everything is going to be relevant for everyone all of the time. So please, take a view of which you think are most relevant and which you think are they all relevant? Are some of them less relevant? It just depends. So I'll give a little bit of time for the answers to come in. I like this a lot because it doesn't only show the answers, it also shows the distribution as well. So it looks like right now, emissions and energy variables are the ones you see as most important, with investment variables and socioeconomic ones being close behind. Price variables, I think, is an interesting one because they will be very relevant in the short term, but with these scenarios are not necessarily always as relevant or intuitive. That's not to say that there's a wrong answer here, but again, to say, are all of these important? Are some of these more important than others? It's interesting to see that energy is the most, but everyone is kind of at a similar place with many of the other ones, with demand being a little bit less important. Now, this is an opportunity just to share any specific variables that you're most interested in. So these are things like oil price, electric vehicles sold, investment in energy efficiency, any of these kinds of questions. That's what we could share here. And getting kind of that variable wish list, I think will be useful because maybe from peers, you'll see variables that you maybe didn't necessarily consider, but are interesting for you as well. So impacts in agriculture. And also consider these mostly on the transition side. So I know that there are physical variables like level of flooding or sea level rise. Think, about what are the, from these transition models, what are the variables you're most interested in? Investment, economic variables, other insights. Just so you can see, I'll scroll down a little more. A lot of questions on investment variables, some on market trends, keep going down, energy sources. Again, we don't need to all answer every question, but if there are other variables that you would like to know about, it would be great to see them. Emissions, economic impacts, efficiency. I'll give maybe 30 more seconds on this one before we go into risk identification itself, which I think will set us up well for our discussion with the Oliver Wyman team, because they'll be talking about risk assessment itself. So what we're going to cover now is local risks. So as I said, the focus here is really on what the risks are and how you measure them. So just if anyone wants to share some of the risks that they've identified, either for their business or within the country on the transition side as you move to net zero. I think this will be helpful because when we hear from the Oliver Wyman team, one of the big questions, one of the big topics is going to be not only which risks are relevant, but also which risks we want to most effectively identify as being drivers of potential financial impacts. So thinking about medium term to long term, 5 years, 10 years or more, what are some of those risks that you see in a net zero 2050 scenario? So, we talked about some of them at a high level. They can be the collapse of a fossil fuel company. It can be that trade policy stagnates because the country becomes an outlier relative to others in terms of its carbon activities. It could be unemployment in energy sectors. It could be volatility of energy prices due to a shift in the balance of energy. It could be potentially longer term or longer run inflation due to required increase in investments. It could be a number of different factors, changes in creditworthiness of companies within high emitting sectors, supply chain disruptions as the economics of net zero come into play. There are a number of factors, and I see a few of them in here. Carbon capture is a great one to mention. The price, the crisis in Europe over the longer term. And again, this is thinking about longer term. I'm going to ask in a moment, the last question will be on the shorter term. So please, feel free to share more insights. Stranded assets is a great point. There are going to be many assets that are unextractable due to current fossil fuel production. So let's see maybe a few more responses to this, and then I'll ask you about short term, which means really over the next year or two, if we start on the road to net zero transition, are there any risks in the short term? And what we're kind of doing together here is doing a little bit of the TCFD disclosure on strategy, exploring what the risks are across short term, medium term, and long term time horizons. Any other points? Financial risks, lack of public policies, socioeconomic crisis. I'll move on now to look at the short-term risks, or sorry, to look at industry-based risks. And this, I think, is one of the ones I'm most interested to see your responses. What sectors do you think are most at risk in a net zero transition scenario? Which ones are least at risk? And interested to see whether your intuition is the same as mine or different, or whether it's unique by country. Remember, low risk is 1, high risk is 5, just so you keep that in mind. So energy related sectors are the highest. Transportation is a bit lower, so is technology. Oil and gas seems to be the highest. Metals and mining, it's interesting. I would have maybe almost pegged that a little bit higher. Agriculture under a transition, curious to hear what people think are the risks. There definitely are in terms of the meat industry. There definitely are in terms of methane emissions, as we talked about in that question earlier. But do we think it's higher than others? Interested maybe to get a few more respondents. And then we'll close this poll and go to our break in a few moments. All right. So hi, everyone. And I think you're getting to know me well being up here. So what we wanted to do, because I've been talking with Maite and with the whole Lacadi team and then with others across the event over the course of the last 2 days is that we really don't want this to be the end of our work together. We know that climate change is a constantly evolving challenge. We know also that the ways in which we confront it, the capabilities we have as organizations, also changes on a regular basis. We get new information, we have new data, we face new challenges. And by staying ahead of the curve in terms of knowledge, we not only can be change makers within our organizations, but we also have the ability to really make a difference for those that are working with us as clients, as stakeholders, and as a larger society as a whole. So what we want to do now is conclude with a series of questions. First, that will get kind of an informal baseline on climate scenarios. We've tried to aim this to get a sense of what kind of scenario work people have been doing already. And then also we want to really conclude with a bit of feedback on how you will use this information over the course of the coming weeks and months, and how we can make these sessions more effective for you in the future. So with that in mind, there are really two parts to our wrap up. The first is giving you the option to share anonymously where you are in terms of practices on climate disclosures and climate scenario analysis, to get a sense of who maybe is already developing these approaches, who sees where their peers are. Again, totally anonymous. I'll ask you to go back to this Menti poll, menti.com, and then the code 48081524. And we'll go to the next questions, and the next few will focus really, as I said, on the progress being made. So it'll give you a baseline of where you and your peers are at. And then finally, we will, as I said, launch into how we use this, how we take this information home. So the first question really is about scenario analysis itself. Have you conducted scenario analysis, or do you plan to? With the idea that we really want to get a sense of what people's plans are, what their intentions are, and when they plan to do this. So I can see that a number of organizations have been planning to do scenario analysis in the coming months. Eager to see more and see what your responses are. So we see a lot of people over the next year, 2023, are going to be looking to do scenario analysis. We see only a few have actually been disclosing that analysis publicly, but a fair share have been doing work internally, which is really great to see. It's important to know that people are working on that and making progress there. I'll give the poll a little bit more time, but I think that this should give people confidence that we are all making progress, and we are all really seeing 2023 as an important year. If you've already worked on scenario analysis, maybe this is the year that your climate disclosures include scenarios. If you haven't, maybe this is the year that you first document these internally and begin to develop the capabilities to do this in-house. So continuing, just to see, giving a few more seconds for any other responses coming in. And then for those, it looks like everyone will be able to answer the next question, because this is looking at whether you've done scenario analysis or whether you plan to in the future. Really asking about, and you can fill out multiple, so don't feel like you need to only select one. You can choose as many of these as you would like to vote for, but getting a sense of whether that analysis that you intend to do and have done is qualitative in nature, quantitative, is it focused on transition risk, focused on physical risk? And as I said, I think a lot of qualitative analysis is to be expected, but really interested to see how many people are doing quantitative analysis, and whether that perhaps is an area for further focus. We've had two great sessions from Management Solutions and Oliver Wyman talking about quantification. But before we even quantify, understanding the scenarios, understanding the risks that are faced really is significant. So we can see here a fairly even mixture. It's interesting to see what that may suggest is that a number of organizations have done quantitative risk as well as qualitative risk. So getting that sense, I think, is quite interesting. Going on to the next question, for those planning to conduct scenario analysis or those that have, we don't just do scenario analysis because it's something to do. We do it because there are uses for it and use cases. So again, you can select multiple options, but getting a sense of which are the most popular options that you will select will be quite interesting. So seeing, and again, as I said, you can select multiple, but seeing which of these are going to be the more predominant, the more frequent, I think that will be very interesting. So a lot of internal and external reporting. I would say those thinking about strategy, to me, that's going to be an important area. If you haven't yet thought of that, that's okay. But I would say that using climate scenarios is not just about things that we need to report by regulation or by expectation, but also a way to gain insights that can leave us better equipped to seize opportunities and also manage our risks. So continuing to check a lot still related to reporting, a few on strategy. As I said, giving a few minutes more for a couple other responses here. And maybe just 10 seconds more. So anyone who hasn't yet responded who wants to, please put in, and you can see, all the different use cases, but also the most common amongst your peers. So if you want to contribute and you haven't yet, please submit your answer. Great. And then one of the things now we're kind of getting into as we move into the final part, this is the tie that connects the two. What challenges are you facing? I'll give people a few minutes and I'll also scroll down if we get a lot of answers. But as we think about future sessions, as we think about where you are looking for support, I know that this is one of the big areas where there's a great opportunity to see whether others have common challenges that you face, see whether as you're conducting scenario analysis, you learn more about how to overcome those challenges, but just a good opportunity both for us to help focus on some of the biggest and most pressing areas for you, but also to see what you have to say. Data is an issue, getting standardized methodology and connecting to macro factors, changing how the whole company operates. I think that's an important one. And that I think links to this other one about aligning the corporate vision. We definitely see that. The data piece, transparent data, lack of data, national and client information. So lack of reliable information, lack of data engagement. So what I think is really interesting here is we see sort of like a few themes spreading out, and I'll keep scrolling down just to give people the opportunity to add more if you have more thoughts. What I'm kind of seeing is, if I had to break this into three themes, I see methodological considerations. How do we do this? I see data. How do we get the data from clients? How do we understand better the data within scenarios and for physical risks? And then finally, I see, how do we actually transition and move our organization to a place where it can make good use of this information? So I see those as the big recurrent themes that many of you are mentioning. Remember, you can input multiple, so feel free if you have multiple challenges, if you want to share other ones, that's great to see as well. And we can continue down here. So giving, maybe a minute more. But as I said, I think these are the big challenges: data, methodology, and implementation within the organizations. The appropriate time horizon, that's one that's certainly a bit more specific, but definitely specific to the scenarios we talked about today. These are long-term scenarios. Those might not be well aligned to your decision-making criteria and your business strategy timelines. Maybe a few more seconds if anyone has any further thoughts. So what we also want to do is really ask you, and feel free also if you want to raise your hand and share your opinions live, but if you want to do them anonymously as well. What are your main takeaways? If you had to sum this up in one key point, one key learning that you've gotten out of this, or your top three bullets. Remember, you can submit multiple answers if you'd like, but I want to know what the tangible learnings are. So not just, climate risk or transition scenarios, but, tell me or tell us, I learned how to use climate transition scenarios. I learned that data is a big challenge for physical risk. I learned that within Mexico, we have a number of different physical risks. Tell me what the things are that you'll take away from this. Some about methodology, obviously that's great. Other thoughts and questions. And also, as I said, if anyone in the room or on Zoom wants to share their views without, just submitting it into the chat, they're very welcome to. Yeah, I think some people are saying, the diversity of risks, but also the diversity of methodologies, the understanding of the range of scenarios that exist. So I think, diversity is definitely one of the takeaways. Uncertainty, and the fact that we are all learning. I really think that's actually this number 2 here, that, everyone is learning right now. We're all in this process. And, even the most advanced, even most developed organizations, nobody has this perfect. And so realizing that means that this is a journey for everyone. And in the cases where our collaborative work can be helpful, we should think about that. That's going to be in places like data requirements. It's going to be in terms of managing risks within the sector overall. But I think there are a tremendous amount of opportunities to act together, to act in forums like this, as well as to understand what different organizations within the country, from the central bank to different parts of the financial sector, are doing and looking to do about climate change. It's important to act now. It is a long road. And I think that means that acting now is more effective. Yeah, there's a question in the back. Do we have another mic? Or?
Sorry, David, where?
Oh, just in the back corner there.
Thank you, sorry. I would like to share, we work for Afore Citibanamex, which is one of the biggest pension funds in Mexico. And we have already adopted some ESG best practices, but we have not adopted any methodology for the determination of the asset allocation. So in summary, we are evaluating climate risk or ESG related risk in the credit process, but we have not included any kind of analysis in the asset allocation process. So my question is there a risk premium for investing in green products or in instruments that are following these pathways? Or how can we include in the asset allocation process all of this information?
So I think there are a few ways. There is a individualized way, and that is by considering the portfolio targets that you aim to set, and then rebalancing the portfolio in line with those targets, as well as determining which investments fit or don't fit into that new investment thesis. There's also, from a pricing standpoint, the idea of potentially accounting for the additional risk. So that kind of is in the process, the second area of risk rating and re-rating potential exposures to get a better sense and a more appropriate set of limits, as well as additional required returns to make that acceptable. Then I would also say, finally, though, there's a number of useful academic and research studies those from Climate Bonds Initiative, as well as from some academics on the risk premium for green bonds. ICMA, which is the International Capital Markets Association, has put together guidance on green bonds and social bonds. That information is, I think, both interesting as well as somewhat empirical in looking at some of the questions that are raised. I'll be totally honest, the answer is a little bit up in the air. If you want to ask about, is there stronger demand for green bonds than there is for non-green bonds? The answer is definitively yes, there is. If you want to say, do green bonds outperform? That is where there are a number of studies supporting that, but there's also a recognition that these are future coming risks. And because they are emerging in the future, we may not see them fully priced in. And so the argument on whether these are fully priced in or not still is going on. But I think the fact that that people are taking these things up and exploring them both through new products, new studies, does show that there's a number of ways to kind of try to get a sense of what that premium might be, and in a more idiosyncratic way for a particular client, what would be appropriate given the updated risk profile, as well as the conformity or lack of conformity with your own investment strategy.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Just to follow up on the question, you've been doing this for a while now, and you've followed what a lot of financial institutions and investment managers have decided to do after they do this assessment, this scenario analysis. And thinking about this balancing your portfolio, have you seen changes in the strategy once this scenario analysis is embedded in more strategic thinking, not necessarily in actual assessment of profitability, but more strategic thinking? Can you share with us some experiences of institutions that have done this?
Yeah, so I think one of the most interesting and perhaps direct cases of this, and you can take it with a little bit of a grain of salt, but it was notable because it was said directly to me, was two of the biggest U.S. banks, two of the most sophisticated commercial financial institutions operating based in the U.S. mentioned that it was the scenario analysis that they had done in the TCFD that convinced them that making a net zero commitment was the most efficient strategy for them to manage their climate risk in the future. And so I thought that was, obviously they may be saying this just to butter me up because, that's kind of the space I work in. But I think that was notable. I also think what we've seen is whether it's in the TCFD annual report, some of the research that's being done, as well as surveys that we've done as UNFFI and that GARP, the Global Association of Risk Professionals, has done about climate risk management. We are seeing more and more stakeholders using this information to make decisions, even if it isn't fully integrated into everything they do, but to say, oh, we need to take this into account. And that can be as micro as we need to hire a position to have someone be our climate czar, or it could be as big and as dynamic as we need to actually update our risk appetite to make sure that climate is fully accounted for. And we're going to write about that in our TCFD report. So everything from the individual person all the way to the systemic have been examples. And as I said, those are still under imperfect conditions. These are not saying everything has been fully integrated, but rather that these are the kinds of decisions people are making with some of the information at hand. So one question is, so there are just a few more quick questions for you. One is, going into application, which is, I want people here to come away with this and say, you learned a lot over the last couple of days, with Management Solutions and Oliver Wyman and Francisco and hopefully myself. What are the things that you are going to apply in your work? What are the things that you either want to do more research on, that you want to share with others? The next question will ask about, how do you intend to discuss these topics with others? So I'd love people, either if someone wants to talk about their experience, what they plan to do. But as I said, we don't want this just to end with this as a workshop. We want this to be really applicable to the work that you are doing. So I'll give a couple minutes, but also if anyone wants to speak about what their application is, how they plan to apply this, we'd love to hear it. So using climate scenarios and macroeconomic forecasting, I think that's a great way to bring some of those insights in. Incorporating into risk management framework. Sharing the knowledge with the team, I think, is one of the most important things. As I said yesterday, you guys are really at the vanguard of this work. You are really leading the way. And so giving you the opportunity to do that, I think, is just so critically important to ensuring that that change happens. Use climate risk assessment methodologies, develop scenarios and use scenarios. I think all of that is great. Risk appetite framework and limits, that's terrific to see. A couple more minutes, and as I said, if anyone wants to share anything with the group, very happy to hear from them there. And also, we'll share with you these responses as well, but we definitely want to have you look at what your peers are saying, and maybe get some ideas for how you could potentially apply these things, and what further learning you might want to do. So thinking about top-down assessments, that's great to see. Working with collaborators to share this information and consider the different scenarios. I think this is one that almost everyone can respond to. So giving you a couple minutes more to do that, and interested to see what you have to say. So I'll give about 30 more seconds, and then we'll go to the second to last question. That second to last question is about actual communication. So really focusing on how will you share this information with others within your organization? How will you talk to your manager about this? How will you talk to your teammates about this? How will you talk to others across the organization and share the things that you've learned? So here, as I said, you have all of this new knowledge. We've covered a lot of ground over the last 2 days. How do you plan to communicate this with your managers, with your executives, with your teams, with the people that you manage? What are the ways that you're thinking of doing that? Just getting a sense, because I think people may have good ideas on how how to do that most effectively. So writing up notes and next steps to share around, I think, is great. Does anyone want to hold any kind of informal learning sessions or lunch and learns with their teammates? I think there's really a wide range of options, but the hope is that you take all of them and you consider which ones will be most effective in reaching the people that you work with. I think an action plan with clear next steps, defining that after this session for you, is really useful. Mm-hmm.
Hi, David. We have a question from Zoom. It says from Sergio Duarte. I don't know if this question has already been answered. These topics can be sometimes complicated to be explained to the board members or executives. Do you think it is feasible for the central bank to include on the risk-free asset, or for capital markets on the market risk, the risk of climate change? So when financial agents analyze investments with, for example, the capital asset pricing model, the climate risk could be embedded by default?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and a technical one about the question of risk weightings and how this is treated from a supervisory standpoint. What I would say is that it's certainly a strategy, and it's been talked about in the EU, in the European Commission, and in a number of central banks about creating risk weighting, and in doing so, changing the relative value as well as pricing of different assets depending on how green they are. It is a blunt instrument, and there is obviously a risk of unintended consequences. We don't want to create potential green asset bubbles where things that are not creditworthy are given financing because they are preferenced over those that are more creditworthy but don't fall into a given criteria. So far what we've seen internationally is that most institutions have talked about this, but have just sort of thought about it theoretically. We haven't really seen anyone implement a risk pricing directly related to carbon. That doesn't mean in the future a risk charge depending on the level of emissions in the portfolio or the exposure to high risk sectors isn't justified. But I think it needs to be, unfortunately, empirically shown that the risk exists, which I think we can show very theoretically and through the discussions today where those risks are. But I think, unfortunately, it's probably going to require a significant default or significant bankruptcy for people to say these assets are definitively more risky. And I think otherwise, what you have is always the debate between supervisors and policymakers of, are we really doing policy here, or are we, just supervising the game? And I think that that's probably going to be, we're going to probably have to wait around until something like that happens before there's direct risk weighting. There might be a country or a few central banks that think about going further and faster, but it is a little bit hard to see because of the unintended consequences. It's theoretically, I think, obviously a useful and workable mechanism. So the last question today, though, just as we think about the future and the future sessions with you and with others across the industry and across Mexico, is what suggestions do you have for us? I'll actually leave this one up for the whole rest of the time. It's the last thing that we wanted to ask, but really getting a sense of what we can do more of, what we can do less of. Do you want more time for each of these topics? Do you want more of an overview? Are there things that we skipped into that a baseline would have been interesting? Is it too simple for you and you want to actually roll up your sleeves and then come back to us with some results? What are the things that will make this most useful for you? And so I hope that this was really valuable. I really appreciate the positive feedback that I've received informally from you, but give us suggestions on things that you want to learn about, things that you want to see next time, structure and format that can make this more valuable to you and your organization. And so, as I said, I'll leave this one up for any suggestions you might have, and just to see how we can incorporate them into your future sessions. So we could talk more about the nature-related financial disclosures, more math, more of the quantitative models. Can definitely have more of a technical bend in a session or two. Other thoughts, feedback, is everything great? More practice and less theory, more preparation ahead of time, more activities, graphs and tables, available business cases. I'll scroll down as you share more perspectives. More of the mathematical, more availability of tools. So I kind of beginning to see some themes here. People want case studies. I think that that's great. People want to hear about related topics, so nature as an example. People also want to get more into some of the mathematical weeds of how do we actually calculate these things? What is the nuts and bolts of the formulas we're using? And that can be, everything from financed emissions all the way up to various loss models. I know that we've talked about in a few cases, the Merton framework. I wasn't speaking about it directly, but that was one. Some of the loss distributions that Francisco was talking about yesterday, those are other options. Let's see, anything else to mention? I think those are, the kind of main categories of feedback that I'm seeing, and that's really helpful. As I said, we're going to leave this up, so you can submit multiple comments, questions, and if a number of them come in, I'll scroll down. But as I said, just a really good opportunity to share any suggestions to make these more effective. So as I said, I'll leave this up, but a huge thank you to everyone here, both in person and online, for joining us. It's a real pleasure to be with you and to share these insights. I hope that they've been helpful, and I hope that more than just being helpful, they will give you the power within your organization to start having these discussions, to start making changes, to start increasing the visibility that you have on how climate risk can be tied into operations, tied into practices. And so for some final words, talking about the broader work, I'll hand it back to Maite to share some of the final concluding thoughts. But thank you again. It's been a pleasure to be with you.